The air above the salt is cool enough to feel almost liquid, and as you stand in the wide white hush of Uyuni, the ground seems to hold the last pale light of evening, as if it has forgotten how to let it go. Under your feet, the crust is not soft sand and not quite stone, but something between them, a surface made from vanished water, patient evaporation, and the slow chemistry of an old inland sea. The horizon is so level that it feels less like a line and more like a breath held gently across the whole earth, while the distant mountains rest in a blue haze, quiet and low, as though they too are listening. There is very little sound here, only the faint brush of air moving over salt, and the small, dry texture beneath each step, where crystals meet crystals in a language older than footsteps. You are not entering this place quickly, and nothing about it asks you to hurry, because the Salar de Uyuni is a landscape made by slowness, by water arriving and leaving, by minerals staying behind, by seasons folding into seasons, until a lake becomes a plain. The salt crust reaches outward in every direction, white and pale grey and sometimes faintly rose with the last sun, and its strangeness begins with how empty it looks, even though it is full of hidden structure. Beneath the clean brightness, there are layers of brine and mud, old sediments and dissolved minerals, and the memory of ancient lakes that once spread across the high Bolivian plateau. The place seems simple at first, almost blank, but that blankness is only the surface of a very long story. If you lower your gaze, the salt is not smooth in the way a polished floor is smooth, and it is not broken in the way dry clay is broken, but arranged into broad, shallow polygons, each one edged by ridges that have lifted themselves slowly from the crust. These shapes can look like a quiet honeycomb stretching for miles under the open sky, and they are one reason Uyuni feels so strange, because the ground seems to have grown a pattern without any hand to guide it. The polygons come from the movement of brine, from evaporation pulling moisture upward, from crystals forming and swelling and pushing against one another in tiny patient increments. What looks like stillness is, at a scale too slow for the eye, a kind of breathing. The salt beneath you is mostly halite, the familiar mineral of common salt, yet here it gathers in a way that feels unfamiliar, because it has become a landscape rather than a seasoning, a crust rather than a grain. Each crystal belongs to a greater field of crystals, and each field belongs to a basin with no easy route to the sea, where water can enter from rain, streams, and groundwater, but can leave mostly through the dry air. When that water rises and spreads, it carries dissolved minerals across the basin, and when the sun and wind take the water away again, those minerals settle into place. Over long stretches of time, this simple exchange becomes enormous, and what was once lake water becomes a bright floor beneath the sky. The high plateau around you, the Altiplano, sits between great mountain ranges, lifted by deep geological forces that shaped the Andes and left broad basins where water could gather. In wetter ancient times, large lakes occupied this region, and as the climate shifted, those lakes shrank, separated, and dried, leaving behind layers of salt, clay, and mineral-rich brine. Uyuni is one of the most striking remnants of that long transformation, a place where the past has not disappeared so much as crystallized. The old water is gone from the surface for much of the year, but its presence remains everywhere, underfoot, beneath the crust, and in the strange, clean brightness that seems to rise from the ground itself. As you walk slowly, or simply imagine yourself walking, the flatness begins to feel almost like a physical thing, a calm pressure around the eyes. There are places on Earth where slopes and ridges constantly guide your attention, but here the land withdraws those familiar instructions, and the plain opens so evenly that distance becomes difficult to measure. This flatness is not accidental, because the basin floor was shaped by lake sediments settling out in quiet water, then by repeated flooding and drying that spread minerals across the surface like a thin, patient glaze. The result is a natural floor so level that the sky seems able to come down and rest on it, without interruption. When rain comes, even a shallow layer of water can change everything, not by adding spectacle in a sudden way, but by returning the salt flat to something like its older memory. The water spreads so thinly across the level crust that it becomes a mirror, and the clouds appear below you as softly as they appear above, while the line between sky and earth loosens until it almost disappears. In that season, Uyuni seems less like land and more like a pause between elements, a place where water remembers being a lake and salt remembers being dissolved. The effect is peaceful, because nothing is hidden by complexity, and yet everything is doubled. But when the water leaves again, drawn upward by sunlight and dry air, the crust returns, not exactly as it was, because each cycle adjusts it with quiet precision. Dissolved salt moves through thin films of brine, gathers along edges and shallow fractures, and builds the raised lines that outline the polygons with delicate persistence. Beneath the surface, denser brines can shift slowly through porous layers, carrying lithium, potassium, magnesium, and other minerals that came from volcanic rocks, weathering mountains and ancient waters. The crust is strange because it is both a roof and a record, both a surface you can stand on and a membrane over a hidden mineral world. The white color has its own kind of silence, because it reflects the sun with such clarity that the ground can seem almost luminous, even under a softened sky. In the morning, the salt may appear blue-white and cool, while by afternoon it can become silver, cream, or faintly golden, depending on the angle of light and the small amount of moisture held near the surface. Every change is gentle, and the landscape does not perform so much as receive, taking the sky into itself and returning it more softly. This is one of Uyuni's quiet mysteries, that the same crust can feel dry as bone and yet behave like a slow mirror of the atmosphere. The mountains around the basin are often far enough away that they seem almost weightless, hovering at the edge of vision rather than enclosing the plain. Their presence matters, though, because they are part of the source of the salt and the chemistry below it, feeding the basin through erosion, groundwater, and the long weathering of volcanic material. Minerals do not simply appear in a salt flat. They arrive in water, grain by grain and ion by ion, released from rock and carried into low places where the water has nowhere simple to go. Uyuni is therefore not separate from the Andes around it, but a quiet center where the mountains have been slowly dissolving into brightness. If you imagine looking down through the crust, not with urgency, but with the patience of geology, you would find that this white plain is not one solid block. There are layers beneath the top surface, alternating bands of salt, sediment, and brine, each one connected to a different period of flooding, drying, and mineral concentration. Some layers hold trapped waters that are far saltier than the sea, and these brines fill pore spaces like a hidden, unmoving tide. The crust above them may feel firm underfoot, yet it belongs to a system that still carries moisture, chemistry, and slow exchange through its quiet interior. The polygon patterns are among the most beautiful signs of that exchange, because they show how even a landscape that appears flat and still can organize itself. As water evaporates from the surface, brine is drawn upward from below, and salt crystals grow, displace, and lift, especially along slight cracks where moisture and minerals can gather with patient regularity. Over time, the edges rise into ridges, and the centers may settle or smooth, creating the repeating shapes that make the plane feel both natural and almost mathematical. No single crystal decides the pattern, of course, yet together they form it, as if the salt were dreaming in geometry. This is a place where the idea of dryness becomes more complicated, because the surface can be arid while the subsurface remains wet with brine. The air may take water away every day, and the sun may bleach the crust into pale brightness, but beneath that dry skin, there is still liquid held in hidden pores and channels. Uyuni's strangeness depends on this contrast, on the meeting of evaporation and saturation, of white dryness above and dense mineral water below. It is a desert, but not empty of water. It is a lake bed, but not simply a lake gone away. At times, the salt crust can sound faintly under a footstep, a small granular compression, a whisper rather than a crack. The sensation reminds you that the surface is made of countless joined crystals, and that even something as vast as Uyuni is built from very small forms repeating beyond sight. In sleep, this is a soothing thought, because the mind can rest inside repetition, following the same pattern outward and outward until the horizon arrives. The salt flat becomes a kind of slow breathing for the land, with each crystal holding its place and each polygon resting beside the next. The ancient lakes that preceded Uyuni did not vanish in a single event, and there is comfort in remembering that landscapes often change by degrees too gentle to notice. A basin fills, a basin dries, a shoreline retreats, a mineral concentrates, and the memory of water becomes brighter and more solid with every season. Lake Tauca and other old water bodies once spread across parts of this plateau, rising and shrinking with changes in climate, rainfall, and evaporation. Their traces remain in shorelines, sediments, and salt deposits, as though the land has kept a quiet diary without using words. When the lake waters were larger, fine particles settled to the bottom in calm layers, and dissolved minerals circulated through waters that slowly became more concentrated. As a region grew drier, evaporation became the patient sculptor, removing water while leaving the dissolved matter behind. Calcium, sodium, chloride, sulfate, carbonate, and other components followed their chemical pathways, forming minerals at different stages as the brine changed. This is not dramatic chemistry, but it is profound chemistry, the kind that builds a shining plane from invisible substances carried in water. The salt crust is strange because it is both young and ancient at once, renewing its surface through seasonal processes while resting on the legacy of lakes that belong to very different climates. A thin film of rain may dissolve the uppermost crystals, and a dry week may return them in new arrangements, so the present is always gently rewriting the past. Yet below those small changes are older layers, deeper records, and the broad basin shape that has held this story for thousands of years. The surface is temporary in detail and enduring in presence, which gives Uyuni its quiet paradox. In the calm of evening, when the temperature eases and the brightness softens, the salt no longer seems stark, but tenderly pale, as if the day has been folded into it. You can imagine the crust cooling slowly, the crystals releasing heat into the air, and the brine below remaining steady in its hidden darkness. The open plain does not need trees or waves or cliffs to feel alive, because its life is mineral, atmospheric, and almost entirely slow. It invites a different kind of attention, one that notices shimmer, levelness, faint ridges, distant islands of rock, and the way the sky lowers itself into silence. Those islands, rising from the salt in some parts of the Salar, are not islands in the ordinary sense now, but remnants of older landscapes, surrounded by a white mineral sea. Some are made of ancient volcanic or coral-like carbonate formations, and they stand as dark, rounded interruptions in the broad plain, giving the eye somewhere to rest after miles of brightness. In wetter times, when lakes filled the basin, these high places may have been true islands, touched by water and ringed by shorelines. Now they hold the memory of that water in their shape, while the salt around them lies calm and dry. The strangeness of Uyuni also comes from scale, because the human body understands a beach, a road, a field, or a lake edge, but this salt flat exceeds those ordinary comparisons. It is wide enough that the mind begins to lose its usual sense of proportion, and the distance between near and far becomes softened by light. A small figure can seem suspended in white space, and a vehicle far away may appear like a dark seed moving across a page. The land is not empty. Rather, it removes clutter so thoroughly that the smallest presence becomes visible. In such openness, the sky becomes part of the geology, because the crust reflects it, receives it, and changes its mood with every cloud. On clear days, the blue above can make the salt seem colder and more luminous, while on overcast days, the whole plain may become pearl-colored, muted, and almost without shadow. At sunset, the polygons catch low light along their ridges, and the ground reveals its pattern more tenderly, each edge holding a thread of brightness before evening covers it. The sky writes temporarily on the salt, and the salt answers by becoming visible in different ways. Beneath that visual quiet, the chemistry is dense and concentrated, because closed basins keep what water brings to them. Rivers that reach the ocean can carry minerals away into global circulation, but Uyuni's waters collect in a basin where evaporation is the main exit, so dissolved materials remain and grow more concentrated over time. This is why salt flats often form in arid regions with interior drainage, where the balance between inflow and evaporation favors accumulation rather than removal. The landscape is strange because absence has made abundance, because the disappearance of water has left behind a vast mineral presence. You might think of the salt crust as the visible edge of an unseen solution, a place where liquid chemistry becomes solid geometry. When brine rises through the crust and evaporates, it leaves crystals near the surface. And when rain returns, some of those crystals dissolve again, creating a slow conversation between solid and liquid states. The crust is therefore never only a crust, but a changing boundary, shaped by capillary movement, temperature, wind, moisture, and the delicate balance of saturation. It is a skin made by water leaving, yet it depends on water still moving below. There is something quietly comforting in this, because Uyuni reminds you that transformation does not always look like motion. A lake can become a salt flat without rushing, a mineral can arrange itself without command, and a landscape can hold great change while appearing perfectly still. The same patience can settle into the body as you listen, like a slow exhale that does not need to finish quickly. Here, everything important happens at the pace of evaporation, crystallization, and light crossing a horizon. The surface underfoot may be rough in one place, powdery in another, damp near shallow water, or firm and bright where the crust is thick. These differences depend on recent weather, the thickness of salt, the depth of brine, and the small variations that ripple through even the flattest terrain. A salt flat can look uniform from far away, yet up close it is a world of edges, grains, plates, ridges, and tiny shining facets. The strangeness grows with attention because the more closely you look, the less blank the whiteness becomes. In the dry season, wind may move across the salar without lifting much dust, because salt behaves differently from loose sand and the crust holds itself together in broad plates. The air can feel clean and spare, carrying very little scent, perhaps only a faint mineral sharpness where moisture has touched the salt. Sound travels in unusual ways across open flats, sometimes seeming distant and softened, sometimes clear because there are few obstacles to interrupt it. Yet the dominant feeling remains quiet, an immense quiet made not by emptiness, but by the absence of hurry. At night, when the sun is gone and the heat of day drains upward, the salar enters a deeper stillness. The white crust becomes grey, then silver, then something almost invisible, while the sky gathers stars so clearly that the whole basin seems to open into depth. Without many nearby lights, the heavens can feel close, and the flat ground gives the stars an uninterrupted stage, as if the old lake has become a mirror for darkness instead of water. Even when no surface water is present, Uyuni still reflects in the imagination, holding the sky as a memory of its lake-born past. The cold of night is part of the high plateau's nature because elevation changes the way air holds heat, and dry air releases warmth quickly after sunset. The salt crust cools along with it, and the whole plain settles into a thin calm, where the body becomes aware of the space around it. In this quiet, the geological story does not feel distant or technical. It feels like something that can be sensed through the skin. The land has cooled and warmed, flooded and dried, dissolved and crystallized so many times that repetition itself seems to rest there. Far below the surface, the brine is not like ordinary fresh groundwater, because it is heavy with dissolved salts and minerals gathered across long periods. This dense liquid occupies pores and cavities within the salt and sediment layers, and it forms an unseen reservoir that helps explain why the crust remains chemically active. Lithium dissolved in these brines has drawn scientific and economic attention, yet in the quiet language of the landscape, it is simply another element carried by water and held by basin time. The minerals are not separate from the beauty, they are part of why the crust exists at all. Volcanic rocks around the Altiplano contribute to this chemistry because weathering releases elements that water can carry into closed basins. Ash, lava, hydrothermal influences, and eroded mountain materials all become part of the long mineral pathway that ends in brine beneath the salt. This connection makes Uyuni feel stranger still, because the white flatness is linked to fireborne rocks, uplifted mountains, vanished lakes, and the invisible work of weather. A place that looks simple and pale is actually the meeting point of many deep processes. The polygon ridges may seem delicate, but they are signs of persistent forces, renewed by cycles of wetting and drying. Slight differences in salinity, temperature, evaporation, and brine flow can encourage salt to gather along certain lines, and over time those lines become raised enough to be seen from a standing height. The pattern is not perfectly regular, because nature rarely repeats itself like a machine, yet it is regular enough to feel ordered and calm. Each polygon is a small basin of its own, a little panel of crust shaped by the same broad processes as the whole salar. When water covers the crust after rain, the polygon ridges may still lie just below the surface, visible as faint lines beneath the reflection. The world above and the world below meet there in a shimmer. Clouds floating across mineral geometry, mountains bending softly in water, only a few centimeters deep. This thin water is enough to transform perception, because it removes the ordinary certainty of ground. You are still standing on salt, but the eye feels as though it has entered the sky. That mirror season does not erase the desert quality of the place, because evaporation is already beginning while the water rests there. Sunlight warms the thin layer, wind brushes it, and molecules of water rise back into the air, leaving the dissolved salt to return to the crust. The process is gentle and nearly silent, and it may happen so evenly that the mirror seems to fade rather than drain. One day there is sky underfoot, and later there is white salt again, patterned and bright. Uyuni's strangeness is not a single feature, but a combination of contradictions that coexist peacefully. It is dry and wet, flat and patterned, empty and mineral-rich, ancient and renewing, earthly and almost celestial when water reflects the clouds. The mind rests among those contrasts because none of them need to be resolved. They simply belong to the place. Like sleep, the salt flat allows opposites to soften into one another until surface and depth, sky and ground, past and present, all become less separate. You can imagine lying down in thought upon the cool salt, not pressing hard into the crust, only feeling the idea of its firmness beneath you. Above, the sky is wide enough to quiet most questions, and below, the old lake bed holds its history in layers that do not need to speak quickly. There is no forest canopy here, no rushing river, no surf breaking over stones, only the pale mineral hush of an inland sea that became land. The simplicity is not emptiness, it is concentration. In the daytime, distant objects can appear oddly distorted by heat and reflection, because light crosses the flat open air with few interruptions. A mound, a person, or a low island may seem to float slightly, softened by mirage, and the horizon may waver as if it were made of water, even when the ground is dry. This happens because temperature differences in the air bend light, especially over broad surfaces heated by the sun. Uyuni, already strange in its geology, becomes stranger through optics, as the atmosphere adds its own quiet uncertainty. Yet these illusions are gentle ones, more like dreams than deceptions, and they suit a place where water has left but still seems present everywhere. The salt flat often feels like a memory of a lake rather than the opposite of one, because its brightness, levelness, and seasonal reflections keep suggesting water to the senses. Even dryness here has a watery shape spread wide and low across the basin. The vanished lake remains in the way the land behaves. The crust itself can vary in thickness, and in some places it may be strong enough to form a broad, continuous surface, while elsewhere moisture and soft sediment may lie nearer. This variation reflects local conditions below the plain, including brine depth, sediment layers, and the way water has moved through the basin. From above, the salar appears unified, almost seamless, but below it is textured by difference. Like many quiet places, it becomes more complex the more gently you attend to it. There is also a softness in the color of the salt when clouds pass over it, because the brilliant whiteness dims without losing its glow. Shadows move across the crust in broad, slow sheets, and the polygons appear and disappear according to the angle of light. A small ridge can become visible for a few moments, then fade back into the general brightness. The land seems to breathe through contrast, revealing itself not all at once, but in patient portions. If you think of time here, it does not arrive as a straight line, but as cycles layered over cycles. Rain comes and goes, brine rises and settles, crystals dissolve and grow, lakes expand and shrink, climates shift, mountains weather, and the basin continues to hold the results. This cyclical nature gives Uyuni its calm power, because the landscape is not finished in the way a carved object is finished. It is ongoing, though so slowly that its motion feels like stillness. The old lake beds of the Altiplano tell a wider story about climate, elevation, and interior drainage across South America's high plateau. During wetter periods, water gathered more extensively, and during drier periods, evaporation exposed sediments and left salts behind in basins like Uyuni and nearby salars. These changes were shaped by rainfall patterns, temperature, glacial influence in surrounding mountains, and the balance between inflow and evaporation. The salt crust is therefore a pale page in a much larger book of regional climate history. But you do not need to hold the whole book in your mind at once. It is enough to notice the smoothness, the coolness, the faint grain, and the way the light rests on each polygon edge with unhurried care. Science can explain the processes, and still the place remains quietly astonishing, because explanation does not remove wonder from a landscape like this. It only lets the wonder settle deeper into the layers beneath the first impression. As evening lowers further, the salt plain takes on the color of the sky's last light, and the mountains become less like objects than silhouettes. The crust underfoot seems less white now and more silver, a calm mineral surface cooling into night. Somewhere below, brine remains in the dark, dense and still, holding dissolved elements in a silence no ear can reach. Above, the air clears, and the first stars appear with the same patience as crystals forming. In that meeting of stars and salt, the strangeness of Uyuni becomes almost tender. The ground was once water, the water became brine, the brine became crystal, and the crystal became a vast plain where the sky can look down and find itself. Nothing in this sequence is rushed, and nothing needs to announce itself. The landscape simply keeps the memory of transformation, and you, resting at its edge, can let your thoughts become just as slow. The salt does not ask to be understood all at once, because it belongs to a scale of time that is larger than ordinary attention. You can follow one idea for a while, perhaps the old lake evaporating under a dry wind, then let it fade into another, perhaps the tiny upward movement of brine through the crust. Each thought dissolves softly into the next, like mineral in water, like cloud in reflection. The salar holds them without effort. And as the night gathers over the high plateau, the whiteness grows quiet beneath the dark, no longer bright, no longer sharp, only faintly present, like a calm breath held by the earth. The polygons remain where they are, the brine remains below, the old lake remains in the layers, and the mountains keep their slow watch around the basin. Everything here is shaped by leaving and remaining, by water that went away and minerals that stayed, by absence that became form. You can rest inside that thought for a long time, while the salt flat stretches outward in every direction, pale and ancient, and perfectly still. Even in darkness, the salt does not become ordinary, because it holds the day's brightness as a memory, softened now beneath the cold stars. The surface that seemed almost blinding in afternoon becomes a quiet pale floor, and the ridges of the polygons settle into shadow like seams in old linen. You can imagine the crust cooling from above, while the deeper brines keep their own steadier temperature, tucked away beneath layers of salt and clay. In that difference between the cold surface and the hidden liquid below, there is another small strangeness, another sign that this place is never only what it seems. The high air over Uyuni can feel very thin, not empty, but spacious in a way that lets silence gather gently around every sound. At this elevation, water behaves with particular delicacy, evaporating readily in the dry air and leaving its minerals behind with remarkable efficiency. The salt flat exists because the basin receives water but does not easily release it except upward, into the atmosphere, where it becomes invisible again. What remains is not simply a residue, but a landscape built from leaving, from the steady upward vanishing of water into sky. When daylight returns, the first light often comes softly, touching the crust before the air has fully warmed, and the white plain glows with a restrained, pearly brightness. The polygons become visible again one by one, their edges catching a thin line of sun, while the centers stay muted and smooth. It is easy to imagine the crust as completely still, yet even then, tiny films of moisture may be shifting through grains and pores. The salar does not move like a river or a dune, but it changes in ways that are better felt through patience than seen in the moment. Salt crystals grow when brine becomes too concentrated to hold all that it carries. And this simple fact is one of the quiet engines beneath the whole scene. As water leaves through evaporation, dissolved ions meet and arrange themselves into crystal structures, forming the cubic mineral halite in countless small repetitions. These crystals may grow along surfaces, within cracks, and around older grains, slowly thickening the crust where conditions allow. The process is gentle enough to seem motionless, but over years and centuries it becomes strong enough to make a plane. The raised polygon edges are especially strange because they make the ground look as though it has been tiled by some patient, invisible hand. In reality, the pattern arises from the interaction of evaporation, capillary flow, salt growth, and small differences in the surface that guide where brine gathers. Water below the crust can move upward along tiny pore spaces, drawn by dryness above, and when it reaches the air, it leaves new salt behind. That new salt can lift and thicken the polygon borders, while the centers remain broader and lower, creating a pattern that repeats without ever becoming perfectly mechanical. There is a softness in knowing that geometry can emerge from such ordinary acts, from water rising, air drying, and minerals finding their places. Uyuni feels strange because it shows order without architecture, pattern without design, and beauty without ornament. The crust is not decorated after it forms, its decoration is the formation itself, written by the physical conditions of the basin. Each polygon is a quiet record of movement, so small that it can only become visible after being repeated again and again. If rain has fallen recently, the surface may hold shallow water in low areas, and the polygons can lie under a clear skin of reflection. The ridges become submerged outlines, wavering slightly beneath the mirror, while clouds pass through them as though the sky has been laid over a map of salt. This thin water may look delicate, but it is chemically active, dissolving some of the surface crystals and redistributing minerals across the crust. Then the dry air returns, and the dissolved salt reappears, not as memory alone, but as new growth on the old surface. The cycle is simple enough to describe, yet impossible to exhaust, because every return of water changes the crust in small ways. A shower may smooth one patch, roughen another, weaken an edge, fill a shallow hollow, or leave a faint crust of fresh crystals where the last film evaporates. Over many seasons, the surface becomes a living archive of weather, not living as an animal or plant is living, but active in the quiet mineral sense. The salt flat remembers rain not by staying wet, but by reshaping itself after the water has gone. Beneath this repeating surface is a thicker history, stored in layers that do not show themselves unless they are drilled, cut, or exposed along an edge. Salt alternates with sediment, brine fills the spaces between grains, and older lake deposits rest under newer crusts, each one connected to a time when climate shifted and water levels changed. In some periods, the basin held expansive lakes. In others, it dried enough for salts to concentrate and crystallize. Uyuni's surface is therefore the latest whisper of a much longer conversation between water, air, rock, and time. The old lakes of the Altiplano were shaped by more than local rain, because mountain snow, glacial melt, atmospheric circulation, and regional climate all influenced how much water entered these closed basins. When conditions were wetter, lake surfaces spread and shorelines climbed, leaving marks on the surrounding landscape that geologists can still read with care. When conditions became drier, the lakes retreated, and the dissolved minerals they carried became more concentrated in the remaining waters. Over time, that retreat helped prepare the salt flat, not as a sudden ending, but as a gradual transformation from open water to luminous crust. There is something soothing about imagining that transformation, because it unfolds too slowly for fear and too steadily for drama. A lake becomes shallower, the shoreline moves, the water brightens with minerals, and the floor receives layer after layer of fine sediment and salt. Birds may have crossed the old waters, winds may have wrinkled their surfaces, and clouds may have reflected where salt now lies dry. The place has changed completely, and yet it has kept the shape of its basin, the level calm of a former lake. In the present, when you stand on the Salar, that lake memory seems to hover just beneath perception, The ground is firm, but its flatness feels aquatic. The horizon is land, but it behaves like an old, shoreless expanse of water. Even the light seems to spread across the salt, as it would across a calm lake, widening, thinning, and slipping gently toward the edges of sight. This is why Uyuni can feel dreamlike without losing its reality, because its surface belongs to land, while its form still belongs to water. The salt crust is also strange because it creates a landscape where depth is hidden by brightness. A mountain shows its depth through shadow and slope, a canyon reveals it by descent, and a forest suggests it through trunks and overlapping leaves, but Uyuni hides depth beneath a pale, nearly level plain. Under that brightness are meters of crust in some areas, brine-bearing layers, old sediments, and a whole sequence of environmental changes. The eye sees simplicity, while the earth below contains an intricate, stacked record. In this way, the Salar is almost like a book with a blank white cover and many pages underneath. The first page is the crust you see, patterned and reflective, but beneath it are chapters of ancient lakes, dry intervals, volcanic minerals, and chemical concentration. Each layer formed under different conditions, though all of them belong to the same broad basin story. To rest your attention on Uyuni is to rest it on hidden depth, where the quietest surface may hold the longest memory. The surrounding volcanoes and highlands help give that memory its mineral richness. Rocks weather under cold nights, strong sun, seasonal moisture, and the subtle work of chemistry, releasing elements that eventually travel with water toward the low basin. Some minerals come from volcanic ash and lava, some from older sediments, and some from groundwater that has moved through rock before reaching the Salar. By the time these waters gather in the basin, they carry more than water. They carry traces of the mountains in dissolved form. Because the basin is closed, those traces do not simply flow away to the ocean. They stay, concentrate, settle, dissolve again, and move through the hidden brine system with slow persistence. This closeness is central to the strangeness of Uyuni, because it allows the ordinary weathering of rock to become extraordinary accumulation. Over long time, the basin becomes a quiet collector, gathering mineral whispers from the surrounding landscape until they form a visible white world. The lithium-rich brines beneath Uyuni are part of this same collecting process, though they belong to the hidden side of the Salar rather than the visible crust. Lithium is present in solution with other salts, held in dense brines that have been concentrated by evaporation and influenced by the regional geology. It is easy for modern attention to focus on that resource, but in the calm language of the landscape, lithium is simply one of many dissolved elements shaped by the basin. The visible salt crust and the hidden brine are not separate stories. They are two expressions of the same long mineral gathering. As you let the scene slow again, the thought of hidden brine beneath the white crust can become almost restful. The surface is dry and cool, while below it, liquid remains in darkness, carrying minerals quietly through pore spaces and layers. The Salar is not hollow, but it is held inside by this secret wetness, this dense memory of water that has not fully gone. In that contrast, Uyuni becomes more than a dry lake bed. It becomes a place where absence and presence overlap. The air may be so clear that distant hills seem close, yet the flatness makes them difficult to place, as though they are both near and far at once. This uncertainty is another part of the Salar's strange calm, because familiar measures of distance begin to loosen across the bright surface. Without trees, buildings, or rolling ground, the eye has fewer anchors, and scale becomes soft around the edges. A small island of rock can seem suspended in open space, while a far mountain may look like a quiet thought at the rim of the world. Mirages can deepen this feeling, especially when warm air near the surface bends the light from the horizon. The result is not frightening, only gently unreal, as if the ground has remembered how to become water for a moment. A distant vehicle may appear to float above the salt, or an island may seem lifted by a pale shimmer. The atmosphere, like the crust, participates in the strangeness, turning heat and distance into a soft visual uncertainty. When the Salar is flooded, this uncertainty becomes even more graceful, because reflection removes the boundary between above and below. A thin layer of water can make the entire plain appear bottomless. even when the water is no deeper than a shallow breath over the salt. Clouds drift underfoot, mountains double themselves, and the sky seems to spread in both directions from your body. It is not a trick so much as a reunion, because for a while the salt flat looks again like the lake bed it once was. The mirror effect depends on the astonishing levelness of the crust, which allows water to spread thinly and evenly across wide areas. If the surface were strongly sloped or broken, the rain would gather in channels, pools, and streams, but here it becomes a broad sheet of reflection. That levelness comes from the ancient lake floor, from sediments settling in calm water, and from the smoothing effects of repeated flooding and evaporation. The landscape's past makes the mirror possible, and the mirror reveals the past in return. In the dry season, when there is no water to reflect the sky, the crust still has a quieter reflective quality. Individual salt crystals catch light and scatter it, making the plain seem to glow from within, especially when the sun is low and the ridges cast delicate shadows. The whiteness is not flat color, but a field of tiny faces, each one angled slightly differently toward the light. Even the most still patch of crust is therefore full of small brightnesses, too many to count and too soft to separate. The texture can vary from smooth plates to rough crystalline clusters, from powdery edges to firm polygonal panels. These variations tell of recent moisture, evaporation rate, salt growth, and small differences in the brine below the crust. A place that looked uniform from afar becomes intricate at your feet, and the eye can wander there almost as it would wander across frost on glass. The Salar invites attention downward, then outward, then downward again, in a rhythm that feels like slow breathing. Some ridges rise only a few centimeters, yet on such a level plain, even this small relief matters. They catch dust, guide thin water, influence where crystals grow, and create the pattern that makes the crust look like a vast natural mosaic. You can picture them forming gradually, not as cracks alone, but as lines of accumulation and slight uplift, where brine has repeatedly reached the surface. The pattern is not fixed forever, because each season may soften, rebuild, or adjust it. It is peaceful to think that the ground beneath you is both fragile and enduring. A footprint may mark the upper crust for a time, rain may alter a ridge, and salt crystals may dissolve under a shallow film of water, yet the system continues with vast patience. The basin remains, the climate continues its cycles, and the minerals keep answering the movement of water and air. Uyuni's surface changes easily in detail, while the larger presence of the salt flat holds steady across generations. This combination of delicacy and scale is part of what makes the crust so unusual. Many landscapes are delicate in small places, such as the edge of a leaf, the skin of a pond, or a patch of frost, but Uyuni spreads delicacy across an immense plain. Its fine crystalline features are not hidden in a corner. They extend under the whole open sky. The result is a feeling of intimacy and vastness at the same time, as though you are looking closely at something that has become the size of a horizon. The ancient climate story beneath Uyuni does not need to be imagined as a single lost lake only, because the basin has known many water levels and many phases. Lakes have expanded, divided, retreated, and left behind separate salas and smaller remnants, each one part of a regional pattern of wet and dry periods. The salt crust is one visible outcome of those shifts, but the broader plateau holds many related traces. Together, they suggest a landscape that has been breathing between water and dryness for a very long time. During wetter intervals, waves may have touched slopes that are now far from any open water, leaving shorelines and deposits along the basin margins. During drier intervals, evaporation concentrated the dissolved load, and salt began to form where water had thinned into brine. This back and forth did not erase the previous stage completely. Instead, it layered new evidence over old evidence. Uyuni's strangeness is partly this layering, the way lake, desert, mirror, crust, and brine all occupy the same place through time. As the sun rises higher, the salt can become intensely bright, yet in a sleepward telling, even that brightness can be softened. You do not have to squint into it. You can simply imagine it diffused through closed eyes, becoming a pale glow behind the darkness. The body rests while the mind travels across a white plain that has no urgency, no edges pressing close, and no need for quick attention. Uyuni becomes an interior landscape, wide enough for thoughts to loosen and settle. The science can remain with you gently, like a quiet companion rather than a lesson. Closed basin, evaporation, halide growth, brine movement, ancient lake sediments, volcanic minerals, polygonal crust, each idea can arrive slowly and then dissolve back into the scene. Nothing needs to be grasped tightly because the landscape itself is an example of slow accumulation. Understanding collects the way salt collects, grain by grain, without strain. If you look toward one of the rocky islands rising from the Salar, its darker form interrupts the brightness with a calm and welcome weight. These islands are remnants of older bedrock and carbonate formations, standing above the salt like memories of shorelines and lake levels. Their slopes may hold hardy plants and cacti, depending on the island and its conditions, adding vertical life to a landscape otherwise dominated by horizontal mineral space. They show that the Salar is not isolated from the living world, even though its central plain feels spare and almost lunar. The life around Uyuni is quiet and adapted to extremes of salinity, dryness, elevation, and seasonal change. Microorganisms can inhabit brines and salt crust environments, while flamingos and other birds may visit nearby wetlands and shallow lagoons, where food webs gather around mineral-rich waters. The salt crust itself is not a lush ecosystem, yet it belongs to a wider ecological setting shaped by water availability, chemistry, and high-altitude climate. Even here, life finds edges and intervals, places where moisture lingers and nourishment becomes possible. This matters because the Salar's strangeness is not only geological, it is ecological in a sparse, delicate way. The vast white center may seem nearly empty, but surrounding lagoons, springs, and wet margins create habitats tied to the same hydrology and mineral flows. Water that enters the basin does not merely make salt. For a time, it also supports algae, microbes, birds, and the quiet circulation of nutrients. The landscape's living elements are subtle, but they are part of its patience. In a place so open, even small signs of life can feel tender. A distant bird crossing the pale horizon, a small plant rooted on a rocky island, or microbial mats in nearby saline waters can seem especially precious because the surrounding space is so immense. Uyuni teaches attention through scarcity, not by withholding beauty, but by making each detail stand gently apart. The fewer the distractions, the more carefully the mind notices what remains. Still, the salt crust remains the central presence, the strange white skin of an old basin. It spreads outward with such calm authority that every other feature seems to relate to it, whether as source, edge, interruption, reflection, or shadow. The mountains fed it with minerals, the climate shaped it through water balance, the brine sustains it from below, and the sky changes it moment by moment with light. It is a landscape made from relationships that are mostly invisible. The crust's whiteness can also influence the local sensation of heat and light, because pale surfaces reflect much of the sunlight that reaches them. This high reflectivity gives the Salar its dazzling daytime quality and helps create the visual impression of radiance rising from the ground. Yet the temperature of the surface still changes with sun, wind, moisture, and night cooling, so the salt moves between brilliance and chill. Like many desert surfaces, it lives in strong contrasts, but the feeling it gives can remain quiet and spacious. You can imagine the day lengthening over the salt and the polygons becoming more distinct as shadows shorten and then lengthen again. Nothing rushes across the plain except light, and even light feels slow here because there is so much room for it to travel. The horizon waits in all directions, unbroken except for mountains and islands softened by distance. In that openness, the mind does not have to climb or descend. It can simply drift outward. Yet beneath the outward drift, the deepest story continues downward into the basin fill. Sediments deposited by ancient lakes, salts precipitated from brines, and clays carried by water all lie in sequence, holding clues to changing environments. Scientists can study these layers to understand past climates, lake levels, and mineral processes, but the listener can receive them more simply as layers of time. The ground is not only ground, it is time made firm enough to stand upon. There is a particular calm in landscapes where the main action has already happened slowly and is still happening slowly. A salt crust does not ask for immediate reaction because its events are too gradual for alarm and too large for ordinary haste. You can rest with processes that began before any person was watching and will continue after any single footstep fades. The Salar becomes a reminder that the earth does much of its work in silence. The reason Uyuni feels so strange then is not that it is unnatural, but that it is natural in a way human senses rarely meet at such scale. It shows evaporation as architecture, chemistry as landscape, stillness as motion, and a vanished lake as a shining plain under the sky. Every part of it is explainable, yet the explanations lead deeper into wonder rather than away from it. The strangeness is the peace of seeing ordinary processes enlarged until they become almost dreamlike. As afternoon slowly leans toward evening again, the salt begins to soften in color, and the white becomes less sharp along the edges of sight. The mountains darken first at their bases, then along their ridges, while the crust keeps a low brightness a little longer, as if reluctant to release the sun. Shadows settle into the polygon seams, and the geometry becomes more visible just before it fades. This is often when the surface feels most alive, though its life is only light moving across mineral form. You can follow one polygon with your eyes, tracing its uneven edges until it joins another, then countless others, spreading outward. The pattern repeats in a way that calms the mind, because it offers structure without demand, variation without surprise. No two shapes are perfectly the same, yet they belong together so naturally that the whole plane feels unified. This is the kind of repetition sleep understands, not a beat, but a gentle continuity. In the dry quiet, the salt ridges may hold small shadows that seem blue or lavender under the lowering sky. The centers of the polygons flatten into pale panels, and the raised borders glow along one side while dimming along the other, creating a soft relief across the plain. Such tiny height differences become visible because the land is otherwise so level. Uyuni teaches that subtlety can become immense when there is enough space around it. The salt flat surface is therefore not merely strange to look at, it changes how looking itself feels. With few vertical forms, your attention moves differently, gliding across brightness, pausing at texture, and returning to the horizon with unhurried ease. The eye is not crowded by detail, but neither is it deprived of detail, because the details lie in pattern, light, and scale. Looking becomes slower, and the mind follows. As night comes, the cold returns with a quiet certainty, and the salt crust releases the stored warmth of the day. The sky deepens above the flat basin, and the old lake bed becomes a broad, dark calm beneath the stars. Somewhere within the crust, minerals hold their crystalline order, while below, brine rests in pore spaces, dense and silent. The landscape continues without needing to be seen, which is perhaps one of its gentlest truths. You can let that unseen continuation settle through you, the way night settles over the Salar, without making any sudden boundary. The crust remains patterned, the basin remains closed, the brine remains mineral-rich, and the memory of water remains woven through everything. The strangeness does not fade in darkness. It becomes quieter, less visual, and more like a thought beneath thought. Uyuni is still the old lake, still the salt plain, still the mirror waiting for rain. And if rain comes again, perhaps days later or weeks later, it will not arrive as an interruption to the story. It will be another turning of the same cycle, another soft return of water to a place that has never fully stopped belonging to water. The first drops will darken the crust, dissolve the upper crystals, and gather in shallow hollows between polygon ridges. Then the plain will begin, very gently, to remember the sky below it again. As the water gathers, the first reflection is not yet perfect, because the crust still shows through in pale ridges and cloudy patches. The salt accepts the rain slowly, darkening in some places and shining in others, while tiny streams of brine begin to move through the seams between polygons. There is no sound large enough to fill the plain, only a soft patter if the rain is still falling, and then the wider quiet of water spreading over level ground. What had seemed like a dry mineral floor becomes a shallow, breathing surface. and the old lake returns in miniature. The strangeness of this return is that the water does not need depth to feel immense. A thin film is enough, because the salar is so level that even a little water can travel far, turning the crust into a mirror that seems wider than the basin itself. The sky doubles, the mountains lengthen downward, and any cloud overhead appears to float beneath your feet with the same softness as above you. In that moment, Uyuni is neither simply land nor simply water, but a quiet joining of both. This joining is temporary, and its temporariness is part of its calm. The water that rests on the surface is already beginning to change, already gathering dissolved salt, already becoming brine as it lies there under the high plateau air. Each hour of sunlight draws some of it upward, and each breath of wind helps the invisible leaving continue. The mirror therefore carries its own ending within it, not as loss, but as the beginning of crystallization again. When water dissolves halite, it does so with a kind of invisible tenderness, loosening the crystal structure into charged particles that drift within the thin liquid. Then, as evaporation concentrates the solution, those particles find one another again and build new crystals, returning to solid form on the surface or within the pores of the crust. This alternation between dissolving and forming is one of the reasons the salt flat feels alive in a mineral way. It is not fixed but breathing through chemistry. The surface may look blank from a distance, yet after rain it becomes full of subtle zones, where some places hold clear water and others become cloudy with suspended salt. Along polygon borders, the brine may gather a little more deeply, and there the reflections can look slightly darker, as though the pattern below is rising through the sky. Small differences in height, too slight to notice on dry days, become visible when water reveals them. The flatness is therefore not featureless, it is simply quiet about its features. As the day warms, the mirror thins, and the reflected clouds begin to fragment into patches, separated by pale crust. The water does not vanish all at once, but retreats through shimmering stages, first losing depth, then losing continuity, then becoming only dampness held near the surface. Salt begins to bloom again where evaporation is strongest, forming delicate crusts that may look powdery, glassy, or faintly granular. The land returns slowly from sky to salt. In these transitions, Uyuni's surface can seem almost dreamlike, because it passes through states that elsewhere would belong to different landscapes. It is a lake for a little while, a mirror for a little while, a wet salt pan, a dry crust, a mosaic, and a bright desert plain, all without moving from its basin. The changes are not abrupt, and they do not break the calm. They are more like the slow turning of a sleeper, barely disturbing the quiet around them. The minerals beneath the crust help hold this cycle in place, because brines below the surface remain connected to the weather above. Dry air pulls water upward through capillary pathways, and the crust answers by forming salt where the liquid reaches the light. Rain reverses part of that movement, dissolving the surface and sending fresh water, now salter by the moment, back into shallow spaces. The salar is a boundary where atmosphere and underground brine keep meeting in slow exchange. This is one reason the crust can be difficult to describe with ordinary categories. It is not merely ground because it is constantly shaped by hidden liquid, and it is not merely dried mud because it is built largely from salt that can dissolve and reform. It is a surface, a membrane, a record, and a reaction zone, all spread across a vast high basin. Its strangeness lies in being many things at once, while appearing as one quiet whiteness. The whiteness itself has layers of meaning, because salt reflects light strongly and gives the salar its almost unearthly brightness. Yet up close, the crust is not pure white everywhere, since dust, clay, moisture, algae in nearby wet areas, and subtle mineral differences can add faint tones of grey, cream, brown or blue shadow. The eye may read it as a single pale expanse, but the surface is composed of countless small variations. Like snow, it becomes more complex the longer you look. Unlike snow, though, this whiteness is not seasonal softness resting on top of another landscape, but the landscape's own mineral skin. It does not melt into streams in the same way, though water can dissolve it and carry its substance into brine. It does not drift on wind like powder unless broken and dried into loose grains, because much of the surface is joined into crust. It is familiar in color and unfamiliar in behavior, which gives it a gentle disorientation. The salt crust is strange too, because it carries the taste of the sea without being made by the sea. Its sodium and chloride are part of global mineral cycles, and yet here they gathered in an inland basin far from waves, tides, and shore. Instead of ocean water drying at the edge of a coast, Uyuni formed from continental waters, collecting dissolved materials and concentrating them over time. It is sea-like in chemistry, lake-like in shape, desert-like in climate, and mountain-born in setting. This mixture of identities makes the Salar feel like a place between worlds. The flatness suggests water, the dryness suggests desert, the salt suggests ocean, and the altitude suggests sky, while the crust beneath you joins them all without confusion. You can stand in one place and feel several landscapes present at once, each one softened into the others. Uyuni is not strange because it refuses explanation, but because each explanation opens into another. The surrounding altiplano deepens that feeling, because it is itself a high, broad world shaped by uplift and internal drainage. Mountains rise around basins, volcanoes hold old fire in their slopes, and cold nights pass over plains where water is precious and light is abundant. In this region, closed basins can preserve the outcomes of climate and chemistry with unusual clarity. Uyuni is the brightest of these outcomes, a white center in a high landscape of rock, air, and ancient water. If you follow the story backward, the salt begins not as a crust, but as ions dispersed in water, too small to see and too ordinary to seem wondrous. They come from weathering rocks, volcanic materials, groundwater pathways, and the continual softening of minerals under sun, rain, frost, and time. Streams and subsurface flow bring them toward the basin, where they remain because there is no simple river to carry them away. Then, evaporation becomes the patient hand that turns dissolved invisibility into visible ground. Evaporation is sometimes described as loss, but at Uyuni it also creates presence. Water rises away as vapor, clear and intangible, while the dissolved salts become more concentrated until they can no longer remain in solution, and then they appear. This appearance is not sudden, but gradual, crystal after crystal, crust after crust, layer after layer. What leaves makes room for what stays. There is a quiet lesson in that, though it does not need to be spoken too strongly. Some landscapes are made by accumulation, some by erosion, and some, like Uyuni, by a delicate partnership between removal and gathering. The water leaves, but not everything leaves with it, and over enough time the remainder becomes vast. A vanished lake can become a white plain, not because the past has been erased, but because part of it stayed behind in another form. The crust's polygonal shapes are like a visible grammar for this process, lines written by evaporation and crystal growth across the surface. They may be broad enough to step inside, with ridges tracing irregular borders and centers lying flatter and quieter. From above, they form repeating cells that resemble honeycomb, dried mud, or frozen foam, though their making is specific to salt and brine. Each comparison helps for a moment, then falls away, because Uyuni's pattern belongs to itself. In some places, the polygons are crisp and bright, their borders raised clearly above the panels they enclose. In others, rain, traffic, wind, or recent dissolving may soften them until the pattern becomes faint, like a memory of geometry rather than geometry itself. This variation makes the crust feel less like a static pavement and more like a responsive surface. It records recent weather with the same quiet patience that deeper layers record ancient climate. The formation of these patterns can be imagined as a slow circulation through the crust. Brine rises towards the dry air, evaporates near cracks and edges, deposits salt and subtly strengthens certain lines, while nearby surfaces settle or dissolve in different ways. Over time, a small inequality becomes a visible ridge, and then that ridge guides future water and salt movement. The pattern builds on itself, gently, as many natural patterns do. This self-reinforcing quality gives Uyuni a sense of quiet intelligence, though the intelligence is only the steady logic of matter responding to conditions. The salt does not plan, yet it organizes. The brine does not choose, yet it moves according to gradients of moisture, density, and pressure. The result is a landscape that seems composed, as if the basin had taken centuries to draw one calm design. It is order without intention, which is one of nature's most soothing forms of beauty. As you imagine walking farther, the scale continues to unfold, with no sudden destination. The polygons pass beneath you, the mountains remain distant, and the air holds the dry mineral clarity of a place where horizons are allowed to breathe. There is no need to arrive quickly at any feature, because the plane itself is the feature, and its sameness is part of its invitation. The longer you remain with it, the more its sameness becomes a kind of depth. On a rocky island, the view changes because height gives the salt flat a broader shape. From above, the Salar appears as a pale expanse filling the basin, and the polygon fields may blur into a texture too fine to separate. The mountains around it show the edges of the old container, the geological bowl where water once spread and minerals still gather. Looking out, you can sense the basin as a whole, not just the crust underfoot. These islands can hold traces of former shorelines, because when ancient lakes stood higher, water touched their sides and shaped their margins. The rock may preserve signs of long contact with water, including carbonate deposits or smooth surfaces, reminders that the white plain was once a lake surrounding higher ground. Now the salt lies where water once opened, and the islands stand in brightness instead of waves. They make the vanished lake easier to feel. Vegetation on these islands, when present, belongs to a different rhythm from the salt below. Cacti may grow slowly in the dry high air, storing water carefully and standing with patient verticality against the immense horizontal plain. Their presence does not interrupt the Salar's calm, but gives it another measure of time, a biological slowness beside a geological one. In Uyuni, even life seems to understand the value of conserving motion. Around the wider region, saline lagoons and wetlands add color and subtle movement to the mineral world. Flamingos may feed in shallow waters where algae and tiny organisms gather, their pale forms moving through reflections with delicate care. These ecosystems depend on water chemistry, seasonal variation, and the same closed basin processes that shape the salt flat. The Salar story therefore extends beyond the crust itself into the quiet edges where minerals, water, and life meet. Still, the central salt flat remains spare, and that spareness is not an absence to be corrected. It is the natural expression of high salinity, dryness, altitude, and broad exposure, all working together to create a minimal landscape with immense presence. In a world often full of overlapping sounds and forms, Uyuni's openness feels like a long exhale. It gives the mind fewer things to hold, and so each thing becomes gentler. The sky above the Salar can be very large, not because it is different from other skies, but because the ground does so little to interrupt it. Clouds become important here, each one casting a slow shade or preparing a future reflection if water lies on the crust. A cloud bank on the horizon can seem like a distant mountain range of vapor, while a clear sky can make the whole basin feel suspended in blue. The salt flat is a landscape of earth, but it constantly gives half its attention to the sky. This is part of why photographs of Uyuni often feel unreal, though the place itself is entirely real. The camera sees what the eye also senses: the loss of ordinary boundaries, the blending of ground and air, the strange equality of above and below after rain. Yet the deeper strangeness is not only visual, it is the geological story that allowed such a mirror to form. Without the ancient lake floor, the level basin, the salt crust, and the seasonal water, the sky would have nowhere so perfect to lie down. In dry months, the light can become almost architectural, revealing the crust through contrast rather than reflection. Low sun draws long shadows from shallow ridges, and the polygon network stands out as a raised map over the pale panels. Every border becomes a little horizon of its own, every cell a small country of salt. The effect is quiet, repetitive, and deeply calming, because the pattern extends without demanding interpretation. Wind may cross the Salar with little resistance, moving over the crust in broad, invisible sheets. It can carry coolness in the morning, warmth in the afternoon, or a faint mineral dryness that touches the lips with salt. Because the landscape is so open, wind becomes easier to imagine as a shape, not seen directly, but understood by the way it passes through the body and over the ground. Even the air seems to participate in the flatness. That wind helps evaporation continue, lifting water molecules away from damp surfaces and shallow films. As it does, the brine left behind becomes more concentrated, and the crust prepares once again for crystallization. The process may happen in tiny patches, around a shallow puddle, along a ridge, within a small pore, or across a wide damp area after flooding. The same basic chemistry repeats at many scales, from microscopic films to basin-wide cycles. The repetition is restful because it is not mechanical. Each cycle resembles the last, but weather varies. Water depth varies, temperature varies, and the crust responds with subtle differences. This is how natural patterns remain alive to the eye, even when they are based on recurring processes. Uyuni repeats itself the way waves do, never exactly the same, never entirely different. If you imagine touching a dry piece of crust, it might feel rough, granular, and cool in shade, with small, sharp edges where crystals meet. Under stronger sun, it may feel warm at the surface, though the memory of cool mineral depth remains in its color and texture. The sensation is not like soil and not like beach sand, because the grains are joined, dissolved, and rejoined by chemistry. It is earth-made soluble. That solubility is one of the crust's most important qualities. Many rocks resist water for long periods, but salt openly enters into relationship with water, dissolving and returning, losing shape and gaining it again with ease. This makes the surface unusually responsive to weather, especially in a basin where rain can briefly become wide water. Uyuni's crust seems permanent from far away, yet its uppermost forms are always available to change. The deeper layers change more slowly, holding the accumulated products of older climates and older lakes. They are less like a surface pattern and more like a buried archive, where salt and sediment preserve evidence of conditions that no longer exist. In cores taken from such basins, scientists can read changes in mineral content, grain size, and chemistry to reconstruct environmental history. For sleep, it is enough to picture those layers resting quietly below, pages closed but not lost. The idea of a closed basin can also be soothing because it gives the landscape a contained quality. Water enters, settles, spreads, evaporates, and leaves its minerals inside the bowl of the plateau, where mountains and subtle drainage divides keep the story gathered. The basin holds its past more completely than a river valley might, because there is no strong outgoing current carrying the record away. Uyuni is a place where time has pooled. Even the name of the place can seem to carry a quiet weight, tied to the town and region nearby, but the land itself speaks mostly through form. The Salar does not explain itself in words. It offers brightness, flatness, salt, and distance, and lets understanding arrive slowly. You can think of it as a field of mineral silence, high under the Andean sky. It is not barren in meaning, only restrained in expression. As your thoughts move across it, the concept of strangeness becomes softer. Strange does not mean harsh or alarming here. It means beautifully unfamiliar, shaped by conditions that differ from everyday ground and water. It means a crust made by an old lake, a mirror made by a shallow film, a pattern made by brine, and a desert that still belongs to water. It means the ordinary laws of nature arranged in an extraordinary calm. Toward evening, the temperature lowers again, and the salt begins to release the day. The white surface dims to pearl, then grey, while the polygon ridges keep a faint outline beneath the fading sky. If water remains in thin sheets, it darkens first, becoming a quiet window to the colors above, then a darker mirror for the first stars. The Salar returns to night by slow degrees. There is no need to hurry with it. The crust has waited through ancient lakes, dry ages, wet seasons, cold nights, and countless evaporations, and it can hold one more still moment without effort. You can let the landscape widen in the mind until there is no single point to focus on, only the feeling of white ground stretching outward and the sky settling down. The body can become heavy in the gentlest way, like salt settling from clear water. Below the surface, the brine does not sleep, but it rests in its own slow condition, dense and saturated and held by layers of sediment and salt. It may move through tiny spaces, guided by pressure, chemistry, and the pull of dryness above, but its motion is so gradual that stillness remains the truest feeling. The hidden liquid keeps the crust connected to the ancient lake story, a remnant and continuation at the same time. Uyuni is dry above, wet below, and calm throughout. This layered calm is perhaps the deepest reason the salt crust feels so strange. It asks the mind to accept that a landscape can be bright and hidden, solid and soluble, empty-looking and full of process, simple in outline and intricate in origin. Each contradiction softens rather than sharpens the place, because none of them are conflicts. They are just the ways a closed basin becomes itself. The mountains at the edge of the Salar fade further into blue, and their long mineral contributions become invisible again. They will keep weathering slowly, under frost and sun and thin air, sending tiny amounts of dissolved material towards the basin whenever water finds a path. The process is too small to notice in a day, and too large to ignore across time. Uyuni is not only what lies flat in the center, but what the surrounding heights have offered to it. When the last light settles, the crust seems to become less a surface than a presence. It no longer dazzles, no longer reflects sharply, and no longer shows every ridge, but it remains beneath the dark as a vast, quiet thing. The old lake bed holds its shape without needing light to confirm it. In the mind, it can stay pale and still, a gentle floor beneath a sky of stars. And somewhere in that darkness, each salt crystal keeps its order, each polygon keeps its place, and each hidden layer keeps the memory of water moving through time. The Salar does not need to speak, because its silence is already full of evaporation, reflection, ancient lakes, mineral weathering, and the slow return of crystals after rain. You can rest with that fullness, without naming all of it. The white plain stretches on, calm and strange, under the night air. The night does not erase the salt flat so much as soften it into a quieter kind of presence, where the surface becomes a pale idea beneath the stars. In that dimness, the strangeness of Uyuni feels less visual and more inward, as if the land is asking to be understood by patience rather than sight. The crust is still there, with its polygons and ridges and hidden brines, but darkness lets the mind feel the older basin beneath them. You can imagine all that mineral order resting under the cold sky, untroubled by whether it is seen. Above the high plateau, stars appear with unusual clarity because the air is dry, the elevation is great, and the horizon lies open in wide directions. The salt below answers with a faint pallor, not a mirror now, unless water remains, but a memory of reflection held in pale ground. There is a sense that sky and crust are made for one another here, because each one enlarges the other through emptiness. The stars make the plain feel deeper, and the plain makes the stars feel wider. In daylight, the Salar can overwhelm with brightness, but at night it becomes gentle enough to enter like a slow thought. The white crust turns grey and then nearly silver, and the polygon ridges become subtle shadows, where a little starlight or moonlight touches them. If the moon is high, the salt may glow as though lit from within, spreading a calm mineral sheen across the basin. This glow is not warmth, but it can still feel comforting because it shows that even cold landscapes can hold softness. The cold itself belongs to the salt flat's rhythm because high deserts often lose heat quickly when the sun goes down. Dry air does not hold warmth for long, and the open plain gives the day's heat back to the sky with quiet efficiency. The surface cools, the shallow moisture slows, and the brines below remain buffered by layers of salt and sediment. Above and below, temperatures differ, and the crust rests between them like a thin white pause. This pause is one of the things that makes the salt crust so unusual, because it is an interface between atmosphere and geology. The air pulls water upward, the basin holds mineral brine below, and the crust itself becomes the meeting place where evaporation and crystallization leave visible signs. It is a line between worlds, but not a hard line, because water crosses it, salt crosses it, and heat crosses it every day. Uyuni's surface is less a boundary than a slow conversation. Even when nothing seems to happen, the conversation continues through minute changes in humidity, temperature, and salinity. A crystal may grow along a pore, a damp patch may concentrate slightly, or a thin film may dissolve an edge and move its salt a little farther away. These changes are so small that the human eye cannot follow them as events. Yet the crust we see, the vast patterned plain, is the result of such uncountable small acts joining across time. There is comfort in that scale because it allows the mind to set down the need for sudden meaning. Uyuni's beauty is not explained by one cause, but by many quiet causes repeating until they become landscape. Ancient lakes, closed drainage, volcanic minerals, evaporation, high altitude, brine movement, crystal growth, and seasonal rain all contribute without hurry. The salt flat is the calm sum of processes that never needed to be dramatic. If you imagine returning to the surface at dawn, the first edge of light touches the mountains before it reaches the plain. Their dark silhouettes slowly separate from the sky, and the crust begins to take on a soft whiteness, as though the night is lifting out of each polygon. The cold remains close to the ground for a while, and the air may feel still enough that even distant shapes appear suspended. Morning here does not arrive with noise, it brightens the silence. As the light grows, small details return to the eye, first as faint lines, then as texture, then as the full mosaic of salt. The polygon ridges, which nearly disappeared overnight, begin to reveal their geometry again, their raised edges catching the low sun before the centers brighten. In this angled light, the surface may look more three-dimensional than it does at noon, when brightness can flatten every detail. The morning shows the crust as a relief map of tiny mineral movements. The shapes are irregular, yet they feel harmonious because they arise from the same conditions repeated across a broad plain. Some cells are wide, some narrow, some almost hexagonal, others stretched or broken, and all of them belong to the same patterning tendency within the crust. Nature often finds such forms when forces spread evenly across a surface, then organize around small differences. At Uyuni, the forces are evaporation, brine flow, crystal growth, and the gentle stress of salt expanding and rearranging. The ridges may form because brine rising through cracks leaves salt along the edges, and because those edges then guide more moisture toward them. This is a kind of feedback very slow and very physical, where a slight raised line becomes a better place for future deposition. Over time, it lifts just enough to be seen, while the adjacent panels remain smoother and lower. The crust becomes a self-written pattern, revised by each season of water and dryness. When you think of a landscape writing itself, the thought can become restful rather than strange. No hand draws the polygons, no tool carves them, and no single moment finishes the design. The pattern comes from conditions meeting matter, and matter responding according to its own quiet rules. It is a reminder that the earth often makes beauty by allowing small tendencies to continue for a long time. The salt crust is also strange because it can feel both sterile and full of story. At first glance, there are few plants, few animals, and little organic softness on the central plain, yet the absence opens room for the geological story to become vivid. The land is not crowded with signs, so the signs it does hold become larger in the mind. A ridge of salt, a damp margin, a distant island, and a reflected cloud can each feel like a complete chapter. Around the edges of the cellar, where fresh or brackish water may enter, the story becomes more mixed. There can be wetlands, springs, and shallow waters with their own delicate ecologies, places where minerals and moisture allow life to gather in quiet concentration. Microbes, algae, invertebrates, and birds may depend on these edges, where the harshness of pure salt is softened by movement and mixing. The central crust may be spare, but the basin as a whole is not lifeless. These edges matter because they reveal that Uyuni is a system rather than a single white surface. Water arrives from beyond the crust, carrying dissolved material, sediment, and sometimes nutrients, then spreads, evaporates, and leaves traces in different forms. Some traces become salt, some become brine, some support life for a season, and some settle as fine sediment beneath the surface. The salt flat is the visible center of a larger hydrological breathing. The word hydrology can sound technical, but here it simply means the way water moves through the place. It falls as rain, arrives through streams, seeps through groundwater, pools in shallow sheets, evaporates into dry air, and leaves mineral evidence behind. Each pathway is slow enough to imagine gently, like a thread being drawn through the basin. The strangeness of Uyuni comes partly from the fact that water is both scarce and everywhere in the story. A closed basin makes this story especially concentrated because the water does not have a clear outward river to carry its dissolved load to the sea. Instead, the basin keeps receiving and keeping, turning the ordinary chemistry of weathered rock into the extraordinary brightness of salt. This is why places like Uyuni often form where climate, topography, and drainage all favor evaporation over escape. The land becomes a bowl in which minerals slowly gather. The bowl itself was made by deep forces, by the uplift of the Andes and the creation of the altiplano between mountain ranges. This high plateau holds basins that are neither simply mountain valleys nor lowland plains, but broad elevated spaces where water can linger under a strong sky. Uyuni lies within that setting, shaped by tectonic history as surely as by rainfall and evaporation. Its white crust is therefore connected to the raising of mountains, even though it feels flat beyond measure. The mountains can seem distant and passive from the salt flat, but they are part of the active story. They guide drainage, influence weather, supply minerals through erosion, and frame the basin with a quiet presence that becomes more apparent near sunrise and sunset. Their rocks break down grain by grain, releasing material that water may carry toward lower ground. Over long time, the mountains contribute themselves to the salt. This is not destruction in a dramatic sense, but transformation. Rock becomes sediment, mineral becomes solution, water becomes brine, brine becomes crust, and the landscape changes form while keeping continuity. Uyuni is strange because it makes that continuity visible in a broad, almost dreamlike way. You can look at the salt and understand, softly, that mountains and lakes and air have all passed through it. As the morning warms, the crust begins its daily exchange with the atmosphere again. Moisture held near the surface lifts into the air, brine concentrates in tiny spaces, and crystals may grow where the solution reaches saturation. The word saturation simply means that the water has carried as much dissolved salt as it can under those conditions, and any further evaporation encourages minerals to form. This idea, though simple, becomes enormous when spread across a salt flat wider than many cities. Under the sun, the white surface reflects so much light that shadows can seem especially clean. A small ridge casts a narrow blue-grey line, and a footprint, if one is present, may appear more distinct than expected because the surrounding crust is so bright. Light behaves differently in places with little clutter. It has room to lie flat, scatter, return, and reveal the smallest relief. This light can make Uyuni feel almost otherworldly, yet everything about it belongs to Earth. Salt crystals have faces, those faces reflect sunlight, the flat plain lacks tall interruptions, and the dry air allows a clarity that can seem unreal. The effect is not magic, but physics made beautiful by scale. The ordinary behavior of light becomes extraordinary because the surface receiving it is so wide and pale. The salt is not always perfectly clean white, and its imperfections make it more real and more soothing. Dust from nearby deserts, clay from old lake sediments, mineral stains, damp patches, and wind-borne particles can add gentle variation to the surface. These tones keep the salar from becoming blank, even when it appears nearly featureless from afar. They remind you that the crust belongs to a living planet of weather, rock, and movement. After long dry periods, some areas may become rougher, with salt crystals growing into small ridges, flakes, or crusty forms. Other places may remain smoother, especially where recent water has dissolved and relayed the surface in a thin, even film. This diversity of texture helps explain why Uyuni can appear different from one visit to another, or even from one part of the day to the next. The crust is a changing surface over a changing subsurface. The subsurface brine is heavier than fresh water because it carries so many dissolved salts. It can sit within porous layers, beneath and within the crust, forming a dense, hidden world where chemistry is concentrated and movement is slow. This brine is part of why the crust is not merely dry residue, but an active evaporite system with ongoing exchange. The surface draws from it, and the weather modifies it, in a cycle that continues without visible urgency. Evaporite is a useful word here. because it describes minerals formed by the evaporation of water. In Uyuni, the evaporite landscape is not a small deposit tucked into rock, but a vast open plain that you can imagine standing upon. Halite dominates the visible crust, while other minerals and dissolved elements occur in the brines and layers beneath. The word may be scientific, yet the thing itself is simple to feel. Water left, and minerals remained. That remaining is not passive, because minerals respond to their surroundings. They crystallize, dissolve, recrystallize, compact, crack, and bond, forming structures that depend on temperature, concentration, and the movement of water. The crust may be quiet, but it is not inert in the way a sealed stone might be inert. It is exposed, soluble, and intimately connected to the air above it. This connection creates a special kind of vulnerability, though not a frightening one. A change in rainfall, evaporation, temperature, or surface disturbance can alter the crust's form, because the balance that makes it is delicate. Yet the Salar has endured many natural cycles, and its larger history includes changes far greater than a single season. It is delicate in detail and enduring in scale. The mind can rest in that contrast, as it rests in the contrast between breath and body, small movement, and larger stillness. Uyuni's surface changes like breath, while the basin holds like bone, broad and steady beneath the sky. Rain may polish it, drought may roughen it, brine may lift its seams, and light may change its color hour by hour. Still, the salt flat remains recognizable, a calm white presence at the heart of the plateau. In the middle of the Salar, distance becomes strangely quiet because there is so little to measure it by. A far vehicle, a rock island, or a person walking may seem smaller or nearer than expected, and the scale of the plain gently unsettles ordinary perception. This is not disorientation in a harsh sense, but a soft loosening of habit. The mind gives up trying to calculate and begins simply to receive space. That reception is part of why Uyuni suits a sleepwood imagination. The flatness smooths attention, the repeating polygons soften thought, and the slow science beneath the crust offers depth without urgency. There is always another layer to consider, but none of the layers demand quick understanding. They wait, as the salt waits, as the basin waits, as old lake sediments wait below the surface. If a thin wind moves over the crust, it may carry almost no scent at all, or only a dry mineral trace. The lack of strong fragrance adds to the spare clarity of the place, leaving sight, temperature, and silence to shape the experience. The body feels the air more than it smells it, and the eyes feel the brightness more than they interpret it. Uyuni becomes almost elemental, made of salt, sky, cold, sun, and time. The word time is perhaps unavoidable here, because the salt crust is a visible effect of durations far longer than a human night. Ancient lakes rose and fell, climates shifted, minerals accumulated, and countless wet-dry cycles revised the surface that now seems so immediate. You can place your attention on one crystal, and then let it expand outward into the whole history of the basin. Small and vast become connected without strain. A single halite crystal, if held in the mind, has a cubic order that reflects the arrangement of sodium and chloride ions. It is a tiny structure, clear or white, simple and regular, yet when multiplied beyond counting, it becomes a landscape. This is one of Uyuni's most soothing surprises, that a plane so immense can be understood through the repetition of very small forms. The vastness is built from tiny geometries. Those geometries do not remain perfect at the surface because wind, water, dust, and pressure alter them. Crystals break, dissolve, grow together, and form crusts that are composite rather than pure, blending individual forms into a broad mineral skin. Up close, the salt may look granular, rough, laminated, or crusted, depending on how recently it formed and how it has weathered. The beauty lies not in purity, but in continual becoming. When water lies on the Salar, the crystals at the surface enter that becoming more visibly. Edges soften, grains loosen, and the clear, shallow water gathers salt until it becomes brine, while the reflected sky trembles over the dissolving ground. Then evaporation reverses the movement, encouraging new crystals to appear along edges and films. The same salt may pass from solid to solution and back again, participating in a cycle as quiet as breathing. This cycle is different from the flowing rivers and crashing coastlines people often imagine when thinking of water shaping land. At Uyuni, water shapes by lingering, thinning, leaving and returning, and its most important force is not impact but concentration. It does not carve a canyon here. It prepares a crust. It does not rush away with sediment. It stays long enough for minerals to gather. The result is a geological wonder that looks almost empty while containing an intense history of interaction. The crust is a visible trace of climate, hydrology, tectonics, chemistry, and time. Yet it presents itself as a simple white plain under a blue sky. The simplicity is what allows the mind to enter it slowly. The details are there, but they are not crowded. They emerge one at a time. As afternoon begins again in the imagination, heat may rise gently from the surface, bending light near the horizon. The distant mountains waver, and their bases may blur into pale bands that resemble water. This mirage is made by air of different temperatures, bending light. And it suits the Salar because the land already holds so much memory of lakes. Even when dry, Uyuni lets the eye believe briefly in water. The mirage does not deceive so much as remind. It reminds you that vision depends on air, temperature, distance, and surface, and that a landscape's appearance is always a meeting between place and perception. Uyuni is strange, partly because those meetings become visible there. Light, salt, water, air, and the eye all participate in the experience. Near the horizon, an island of rock can seem to hover in this shimmer, lifted slightly from the white plain. Its dark shape contrasts with the salt, giving the landscape a center for a moment, a place where attention can rest before drifting outward again. The island may carry cacti, old carbonate traces, and weathered rock, all rising above the former lake floor. It is a reminder that the basin was never merely flat emptiness, but a submerged world with high points and margins. When lakes filled the basin more deeply, those islands would have stood within water, surrounded by reflections, waves, and mineral-rich shores. As lake levels fell, their surroundings changed from water to mudflat to brine to crust, and the islands became stranded in salt. That change must have taken time beyond easy imagining, with shorelines retreating in stages and minerals concentrating in the shrinking water. The islands therefore keep a vertical memory of the lake's former depth. Around them, old shore features may hold evidence of past water levels, though the sleepwood mind does not need to examine them closely. It is enough to sense that the rocks remember water in a different way from the salt. The salt remembers by being what the water left behind, while the islands remember by having once risen through it. Together they make the vanished lake feel almost present. As the sun lowers, the salt flat begins to receive color again. The white shifts towards cream, gold, rose, or faint violet, depending on clouds and dust and the angle of light. The changes can be so gradual that they seem less like transformation and more like breathing. Uyuni does not turn dramatic at sunset. It becomes tender. Long shadows reveal the polygon ridges once more, and the surface grows textured after the flattening brightness of midday. Each ridge holds one side in light and the other in shadow, creating a soft network across the plain. From a distance, the pattern may look like a net laid gently over the earth, but up close it remains salt, rough, and crystalline and real. The beauty comes from this meeting of abstraction and texture. The cooling air slows evaporation near the surface, though the largest cycle continues beyond any single evening. Moisture, brine, salt, and air remain connected through gradients that do not need daylight to exist. The crust rests under the changing sky, but rest is not the same as finality. It is simply the slower face of process. If you let your mind settle with the crust, you can feel how strangeness becomes calm when it is understood slowly. The salt flat is unfamiliar, but not alien in a hostile way. It is earthly, in a manner that everyday landscapes rarely reveal. It shows the planet as chemist, mirror maker, basin keeper, and patient builder of patterns. Each role is quiet, and all of them are present at once. The old water is not gone in the way a sound disappears. It has become layers, brine, crystals, shorelines, reflections after rain, and the levelness that still spreads across the basin floor. It has changed form, and in changing form, it has made the landscape more silent. Uyuni is a lake remembered by salt. That thought can carry you into the next darkness as the plain dims and the first stars open above the mountains. The salt holds below, pale and still, and the brine rests deeper down with its mineral weight. The polygons remain like a language written across the surface, not to be read quickly, but to be felt as repetition and patience. The basin breathes through dryness and rain, through brightness and shadow, through water leaving and salt returning. And under the night, nothing needs to be completed. The crust does not need a final shape, the old lake does not need to return fully, and the sky does not need to explain why it looks so deep above the plain. Everything is already held inside the slow arrangement of the place. You can let the white salt stretch outward in thought, wider and quieter, until even the idea of distance becomes soft. Softness settles first at the edges of thought, the way evening settles first along the mountains before it crosses the white basin. The salt flat remains wide and quiet, its surface no longer bright enough to dazzle, yet still pale enough to feel present beneath the deepening sky. If a little water lies across the crust, it keeps the last color longer than the dry salt, holding a faint rose reflection until darkness slowly gathers it away. The whole place seems to rest between forms, part mineral plain, part vanished lake, part mirror waiting for the next cloud. In that resting, the strangeness of Uyuni becomes almost simple, because the landscape is made from a few patient conditions allowed to continue for a very long time. A basin without an easy outlet, a high dry climate, water carrying dissolved minerals, and sunlight strong enough to lift that water back into the air can make a crust that feels impossible only because it is so large. The same process can happen in a dish, in a small puddle, or along a salty shore, but here the scale changes the feeling completely. What would be a trace elsewhere becomes a horizon. This is often how geological wonders reveal themselves, not by breaking the rules of the earth, but by letting ordinary rules unfold in an extraordinary setting. Evaporation, crystallization, sedimentation, and weathering are not rare processes, yet at Uyuni they gather into a landscape so clear and open that their effects become almost visible to the imagination. You can sense the water leaving, even when the surface is dry, because the salt itself is evidence of departure. The plain is made from what the air could not carry away. The air keeps moving over the salar, thin and dry, and sometimes so transparent that the mountains seem closer than they are. It brushes the crust without leaving footprints, but it shapes the place through evaporation, lifting moisture from shallow films, damp pores, and hidden brines near the surface. Wind does not need to be strong to matter here. It only needs to keep the boundary between water and air open. Over time, even a light wind becomes part of the mineral architecture. When moisture rises through the crust, it follows paths too small to see, moving along grains, cracks, and pores by capillary action. This movement is gentle, but it is also persistent, because dryness above keeps drawing liquid upward from wetter layers below. Once that brine nears the surface, water leaves into the air and salt remains behind, often building along the very openings that allowed the brine to rise. In this way, the crust constructs and modifies its own pathways, a slow, self-shaping skin over the basin. The raised seams of the polygons can be thought of as places where this hidden exchange has become visible. Along those borders, salt has gathered, lifted, and roughened the surface, while the flatter centers lie between them like pale panels under the sky. The pattern is not perfectly regular, and that imperfection is part of its calm. It feels natural because it is ordered without being rigid, repeated without becoming mechanical, and broad without losing its subtle local differences. If you imagine tracing one seam with your eyes at dawn, it might lead you around an irregular cell, and then into another, and then another beyond that. The line may thicken, fade, split, or soften where rain has recently dissolved the crust, yet the network continues outward until distance turns detail into texture. This is a soothing kind of complexity, because it does not crowd the mind. It offers enough variation to hold attention and enough repetition to let attention drift. The strangeness is also tactile, even when you only imagine it. Salt can be hard underfoot, brittle at its edges, grainy where it has broken, and slick in damp places where brine has softened the surface. It can seem firm like stone from a distance, but it belongs to water in a way that stone does not. A little rain can undo its smallest structures, and a little sun can help rebuild them. This willingness to dissolve makes the crust feel strangely temporary, while its immense spread makes it feel enduring. Both impressions are true, because the upper surface may change after one wet season, while the larger salar has been prepared through thousands of years of lake history and mineral concentration. You can hold both scales at once without trying to make them agree too quickly. The salt flat is fragile in detail and ancient in origin, like frost drawn across a window that rests on the memory of a glacier. Under the crust, the brine is dark because no light reaches it, and heavy because so much salt and other dissolved material has gathered there. It sits within the pores and layers beneath the visible plain, not as an underground river rushing through tunnels, but as a dense liquid held in a broad mineral sponge. Some of it may move slowly, guided by pressure and chemistry, while some may remain almost still for long periods. The surface above is bright, but the chemistry beneath belongs to shadow. This hidden brine gives Uyuni a sense of depth that the flat surface does not immediately reveal. The plain looks like the end of a story, the dry floor after water has gone. But the brine below shows that the story is still continuing. Water remains, though altered, concentrated, and tucked beneath salt. It is not the old lake as it once was, open to wind and sky, but it is one of the lake's descendants. The old lakes themselves were never fixed forever, because their shorelines rose and fell as climate changed across the high plateau. In wetter times, water spread widely through the basin. In drier times, it withdrew, leaving more exposed mud, brine, and salt. Each change adjusted the chemistry of the remaining water, making some minerals more likely to form and others more likely to stay dissolved. Uyuni's crust is therefore a kind of still image made from many moving climates. Those climates were shaped by patterns of rainfall, temperature, glacial influence, and atmospheric circulation over the Andes. The details are intricate, but the feeling is simple. Sometimes the basin received more water than the air could quickly remove, and sometimes the air prevailed, drawing the water down into concentration. When water was abundant, the Salar region leaned toward lake. When evaporation dominated, it leaned toward salt. The salt flat you see now is part of that long leaning, that gradual balance between arrival and departure. Water arrives in seasons and through hidden pathways, carrying the dissolved memory of rock, and then water leaves as vapor, becoming invisible while minerals remain below. This repeated separation of water from its load is one of the plain's great quiet themes. The air takes what it can, and the basin keeps the rest. At midday, when the sun is high, the crust may appear flatter and less textured, because shadows withdraw beneath the ridges. The white becomes more complete, almost seamless, and the eye may lose the smaller relief that morning and evening reveal. In that brightness, the salar can feel like a vast pause in the earth's surface, a place where form has been reduced to essence, yet the pattern is still there, waiting for angled light to bring it back. This hiding and revealing happens throughout the day, and it gives the landscape a slow rhythm without movement. Morning shows texture, noon dissolves it into radiance, evening restores it with shadow, and night gathers it into memory. The crust does not need to change much for perception to change deeply. Light alone can make the same surface feel like snow, stone, mirror, parchment, or moonlit water. There is a gentle wonder in that, because it means Uyuni is partly made by the eye's relationship with the surface. The salt crystals scatter light, the air bends distant shapes, shallow water reflects the sky, and the mind joins these signals into a feeling of strangeness. Science can describe each part, yet the full experience remains spacious and quiet. It is not just what the place is, but how slowly it lets itself be seen. Sometimes after rain, the surface becomes so reflective that the horizon nearly disappears, and the body seems to stand inside the sky rather than under it. The water may be only a thin sheet, but because the ground is so level, it holds clouds with extraordinary steadiness. Mountains become doubled silhouettes, birds appear to move through both air and reflection, and the entire basin feels suspended. The old lake has not returned in depth, but it returns in feeling. As evaporation resumes, the reflection grows patchy and the salt begins to show through like pale ground rising from a dream. The mirror breaks into islands of water and crust, and then into dampness, and then into fresh crystals forming along tiny edges. No part of this needs to happen quickly. The salar returns from water to salt, the way a thought returns from sleep, gradually, with traces of the dream still clinging to it. The newly formed crystals may be delicate, because they have grown from a recent film of brine. They can make the surface look frosted, feathery, powdery, or bright with tiny facets that catch the sun. Over time, they may be pressed, dissolved, joined, or broken, becoming part of the thicker crust. In this way, each rain leaves behind not only a memory, but a new contribution to the surface. The surface is therefore young in its outermost details, even though the salar as a whole is old. A ridge may have been altered last season, a crust may have formed after the most recent wetting, while deeper layers were deposited under conditions that belonged to ancient lakes. This layering of ages is one reason Uyuni feels so strange. It lets the present rest directly on top of the distant past. If you could hear time here, it would not sound like a ticking clock, but like water thinning in sunlight and salt quietly gathering at the edge of a film. It would sound like silence, because the processes are too slow and too small to enter ordinary hearing. A lake shrinking over generations, a crystal growing through the night, a mineral settling into sediment, all of these are nearly silent acts. Uyuni is full of them. The basin's stillness is not lifelessness, but a different kind of activity. In nearby wetlands and shallow saline waters, microbes and algae may take advantage of moisture and minerals, and birds may follow those subtle food webs through the high landscape. On rocky islands, plants survive by growing slowly, holding water carefully, and accepting long, dry intervals. Life here does not fill the plain, but it touches its margins with patience. This sparseness gives the ecosystem a restrained beauty, because the living signs appear where conditions allow them, and do not pretend to conquer the salt. A flamingo feeding in a shallow lagoon, a microbial mat darkening a wet edge, or a cactus standing against the bright horizon can feel like a quiet accent in a wide mineral composition. The salt crust remains dominant but not alone. Around it, life gathers in small, careful arrangements. The crust itself may host microscopic life in certain wet or briny niches, though its central expanse is largely defined by salinity, dryness, and exposure. Even this possibility adds softness to the mineral story, because life and geology are not entirely separate on Earth. Where water lingers, however briefly, chemistry can become habitat. The same brine that builds salt may also create narrow conditions where living processes find a way to continue. Still, Uyuni's primary voice is geological, and it speaks in levelness, brightness, and repetition. Its quiet ecosystems exist within the larger frame of a closed basin, and the salt crust remains the most visible sign of that frame. The basin holds, the water comes and goes, the minerals stay, and the surface renews itself in pale increments. This rhythm is simple enough to rest inside. As you imagine moving farther across the salt, the sense of direction may become less important than the sense of depth beneath flatness. Each step crosses a surface that looks similar to the last, yet below every step there is history, with layers of ancient lake mud, halite, brine, and fine sediment stacked in quiet sequence. The horizon stays open, and the sky moves slowly above. The body may feel small, but not unwelcome. That smallness is peaceful because the landscape does not press close. There are no enclosing walls, no dense thickets, no steep drops demanding attention, only an immense openness that lets the mind loosen. The salt flat's scale can be humbling without being harsh, reminding you that not every vast place needs to feel threatening. Some vast places are simply patient. The ground's pale color can make shadows feel precious. A cloud passing overhead may darken a large area of crust, and that moving shade becomes an event because the rest of the world is so bright. The shadow glides without sound, softening the polygons and cooling the reflected light for a few moments. Then it moves on, and the salt returns to its steady glow. These small atmospheric changes matter more in a landscape with so few distractions. Wind, cloud, sun angle, dampness, and distant haze become the shifting moods of the Salar, each one altering the surface without changing its essence. The land seems minimal, but it is responsive to everything around it. Its calm is not blankness, it is sensitivity spread wide. That sensitivity also explains why the crust can be marked by human passage, animal tracks near margins, or tire lines in some accessible areas. A surface formed by delicate wetting and drying can be disturbed, and then weather may slowly soften those marks, or incorporate them into later crust. The salt flat is not outside time or touch, even when it feels otherworldly. It is a real surface, responding to pressure, moisture, and use. Yet in the sleepwood imagination, you can let the broad natural pattern return. The marks fade, the polygons continue, the brine remains below, and the sky spreads evenly across the basin. Uyuni becomes again what it has always been at its deepest scale, a high inland gathering place for water and minerals. Its strangeness is not a performance but a condition. The chemistry beneath the crust includes more than sodium chloride because closed basin brines concentrate a whole suite of dissolved elements. Potassium, magnesium, boron, lithium, sulfate, and carbonate may all be part of the mixture, depending on source rocks, water pathways, and evaporation history. Different minerals form at different concentrations as brine evolves, and some elements remain dissolved longer than others. The visible halite crust is therefore only the most obvious expression of a more complex brine system. This layered chemistry can be imagined without strain, like colors hidden inside white light. The surface shows salt, but beneath it are mineral possibilities still held in liquid form, waiting within the dark pores of the basin fill. Some will crystallize under certain conditions, some will remain dissolved, and some will move slowly with the brine. Uyuni's whiteness contains invisible variety. Volcanic materials in the surrounding region help provide that variety, because volcanic rocks and ash can release elements as they weather. Rainwater, groundwater, and chemical reactions move through those materials, carrying dissolved substances toward lower areas where the basin can collect them. This means the salt flat's quiet surface is connected to ancient eruptions, mountain uplift, and the long cooling of rocks. Fire, water, air, and salt meet here in a very slow form. The thought of fire contributing to such a pale and quiet place is another gentle contradiction. The Salar looks cool, open, and lunar, yet some of its mineral richness traces back to volcanic landscapes shaped by heat. Over time, that heat-borne material becomes weathered rock, dissolved ions, brine, and crust. The transformation is so complete that the old fire is now hidden inside the calm whiteness. In the same way, mountain height becomes basin flatness. The Andes rise, weather, shed material, influence climate, and frame the Altiplano, while Uyuni lies broad and level among their effects. Uplift created the conditions for closed basins, and closed basins allowed salts to concentrate. The tallest forces in the landscape helped make one of the flattest surfaces on Earth. That flatness has practical consequences for water, light, and perception. Because there is so little slope, floodwater spreads widely and shallowly. Because the surface is pale, light reflects strongly. Because there are few landmarks, distance becomes softened. Each quality supports the others, creating the experience people remember as strange. The geology shapes the optics, and the optics shape the feeling. When the salt flat becomes a mirror, the flatness and reflectivity work together with almost perfect calm. A slight breeze may ripple shallow water and blur the clouds, while still air can make the reflection so clear that sky and ground appear nearly equal. The water's shallowness does not reduce the effect, because the eye responds to the surface, not the depth. Uyuni turns a few centimeters of water into a world. After the water leaves, the crust may carry faint records of where it lingered. A smoother patch, a subtle crust, a line of crystals, or a difference in tone can mark the path from wetness back to dryness. These are not dramatic traces, and many disappear under later cycles. Still, the Salar is always being gently edited by its most recent weather. The old lake story is edited more slowly, through sediment layers and chemical deposits that accumulate over centuries and millennia. A shift in climate may change the mineral sequence, the thickness of layers, or the type of sediment settling in the basin. These deeper changes are not visible during a quiet walk, but they give weight to the surface. Beneath each pale step, the past has been arranged in sheets. There is a kind of sleep in layered landscapes, because layers suggest resting, covering, and time held without urgency. The mind can picture sediment settling through still water, salt forming at the bottom of a shrinking lake, and brine sinking into dark spaces as the surface dries. Each image moves downward, not abruptly, but with gravity and quiet. Uyuni becomes a descent into flatness rather than depth, a sinking through time instead of water. The high plateau around the Salar also has its own stillness, marked by broad distances, sparse vegetation, and the cool clarity of altitude. The salt flat belongs to that larger calm, yet it intensifies it by removing even more texture and color from the ground. Where the plateau is open, Uyuni is more open. Where the plateau is dry, Uyuni is mineral dryness made visible. It is the region's patience gathered into one luminous basin. If you imagine the sound of walking there, it is small against the scale of the place. A faint crunch, a slight scrape, perhaps the muted give of crust underfoot, then silence spreading back around it. The sound does not travel into trees or walls, but outward across the plain, where it becomes less important almost immediately. The landscape absorbs attention not by noise, but by space. In that space, the body can feel the passage from ordinary scale into geological scale. The heartbeat slows, the breath lengthens, and the mind begins to move at the pace of evaporation, as though thoughts too can concentrate by letting unnecessary motion rise away. What remains is simple and bright. Salt, sky, basin, brine, mountain, time. The simplicity is not an ending. It is an opening into smaller and deeper details, because each word contains a process, and each process contains many quiet variations. Salt contains crystal structure and solubility. Sky contains light and evaporation. Basin contains tectonics and drainage. Brine contains dissolved histories from rock. Uyuni allows all of this to remain calm. As twilight returns again, the plain can seem to widen even further because fading light removes nearby texture and leaves the horizon to float. The salt becomes a pale hush, the mountains darken into distant forms, and any remaining water holds the first stars with careful stillness. The temperature drops, and the surface begins its nightly cooling. Nothing needs to happen quickly for the scene to change completely. The crust waits through the night with the patience of a landscape that has already waited through ancient lakes. Its polygons do not close, its brines do not announce themselves, and its layers do not rise to be seen. They remain in place, carrying the quiet evidence of water, air, mineral, and time. The Salar is strange because so much is present in such a plain form, and in the dark, when the white surface is only faintly visible, you can still imagine it continuing outward beyond sight. The salt lies under the stars, the hidden brine rests below, and the old basin holds them both with unhurried steadiness. Somewhere, perhaps, a shallow patch of water reflects a piece of sky, while elsewhere, dry crystals keep their small cubic order. The whole landscape breathes through cycles too slow to hear, and that slowness can carry you farther into quiet. Quiet does not arrive all at once on the Salar, because even silence has layers, and each layer settles a little more deeply than the last. The first is the quiet of distance, where mountains stand far away, and the open ground leaves no crowded shape for the eye to hold. Then comes the quiet of the crust itself, that pale mineral stillness made from water's long departure. Beneath it is the deeper quiet of brine, hidden in darkness, carrying dissolved histories without ripple or reflection. This downward feeling is unusual, because the landscape is flat, and yet the mind keeps sinking through it. You sink through the bright surface into the old lake, through the old lake into the basin, and through the basin into the rock that gave its minerals to the water. Every layer leads gently into another, not by visible descent, but by understanding. Uyuni is a horizontal place with vertical memory. The memory begins with water gathering in a high inland basin, where it could spread under the sky without finding a simple path to the sea. It carried fine sediment, dissolved ions, and traces of volcanic and mountain rocks, and it laid them down with patient steadiness as climate shifted around it. When the air was wetter, the lake expanded. When the air was drier, it withdrew and concentrated. In this way, the basin became a quiet instrument for recording change. You can picture the ancient lake at evening, before the salt plain existed in its present form, with low waves moving over water where polygons now lie. The mountains would have reflected dimly on its surface, and islands would have risen through the water as dark shapes against the fading sky. Fine particles would have settled slowly through the lake, so slowly that their downward motion would have been almost impossible to see. Beneath the water, the future salt flat was being prepared grain by grain. As evaporation strengthened, the lake became shallower and richer in dissolved material, and the water's chemistry changed with each stage of concentration. Some minerals formed earlier, some later, and the brine became increasingly dense as the air continued to take water away. Eventually, salt began to gather in layers and crusts, not as a sudden replacement of the lake, but as one phase in a long transformation. The land did not wake one morning as a salar. It became one by degrees. That gradual becoming is part of the peace of Uyuni. The place has no single sharp threshold where water ended and salt began. Only countless transitions between open lake, shallow lake, brine pool, mudflat, crust, and mirror. Each state left something behind, and each one prepared the next. The present landscape carries them all, even when only the white crust is visible. The strange crust underfoot is therefore not a shell over emptiness, but the upper page of a layered basin. It rests above sediments that settled from old water, salts that crystallized from shrinking brines, and liquids still held in pore spaces below. The surface may seem complete, yet it remains connected to the depths beneath it through moisture, chemistry, and pressure. The salar is a surface with roots. These roots do not look like roots, of course. They are mineral pathways, brine-filled spaces, compacted layers, and subtle flows through porous material. Yet they anchor the visible crust to the hidden basin, just as roots anchor a tree to unseen soil. The comparison is gentle and not exact, but it helps the mind feel how the white plain belongs to something below. What you see is sustained by what you do not see. In dry weather, the upper crust may become firm and bright, while the deeper brines continue to exist in darkness beneath it. In wet weather, rainwater briefly softens the boundary, dissolving surface salt and blending with the salty world below. The distinction between above and below is never absolute, because water can move through it, and salt can pass between solid and solution. Uyuni's crust is strange because it is both barrier and bridge. This bridge is built through small openings, fractures, pores, and crystal boundaries, where brine can rise and evaporating water can leave minerals behind. The movement is slow, but the result is broad, visible, and lasting enough to shape the land. In places, the crust grows thicker. In others, it may thin, soften, or be reworked by seasonal water. The salar's surface is therefore a record of slow exchange rather than a fixed lid. At times, you might imagine the brine below as a hidden lake, but it is quieter and more intricate than that. It does not spread open beneath the crust as a single clear chamber, but occupies spaces within layers, held in the texture of salt and sediment. It is heavy with dissolved minerals, less like rainwater than like an ancient concentration of many arrivals. Its stillness is not emptiness, but saturation. Saturation is a restful idea when it is placed in this landscape, because it means the water has carried all it can carry under the conditions around it. There is a point where the liquid and the minerals come into a kind of balance, and from that balance, crystals may grow if more water leaves. The crust is made from such thresholds repeated over time. A little more evaporation, a little more salt, a little more solid ground. The word crust can make the surface sound thin and brittle, and in places it may be, but at the scale of the salar it becomes a whole terrain. It can support broad patterns, hold seasonal water, reflect the sky, and cover hidden brines with a pale continuity that feels almost endless from the ground. This is another part of Uyuni's strangeness, that something formed from dissolution and drying can become so expansive. The fragile becomes vast. When the sun rises across the salt, the first long light returns texture to the surface, bringing back the polygon scenes from the quiet of night. Each ridge casts a soft shadow, and each panel brightens slowly until the crust looks like a field of geometry resting under the morning sky. The pattern is not imposed from outside. It has grown from the conditions of the place. It is the Salar's own handwriting. This handwriting changes with weather, and that change gives it a living rhythm without making it alive in the ordinary sense. Rain can blur a line, evaporation can sharpen it, crystals can build along an edge, and dampness can settle in the lower centers between ridges. The pattern survives by being remade. It is not preserved like carving in stone, but renewed like ripples returning after wind. A salt polygon may seem small compared with the whole basin, yet it contains the same themes as the salar itself. It has an edge and an interior, a history of water movement, a relation to evaporation, and a place within a larger pattern. It is a basin within a basin, a little repetition of the greater structure. Looking closely at one polygon is another way of looking across the entire salt flat. The centers of the polygons can be slightly lower or smoother, while the borders rise like low rims, and water may collect or move differently across these subtle forms. These differences matter because the entire landscape is so nearly level that even small relief becomes important. A few centimeters can guide moisture, shape evaporation, and affect where new salt grows. On Uyuni, the smallest height becomes meaningful. The same is true of color. A faint grey tone may reveal moisture or clay, a creamy patch may show new salt, a darker line may mark dampness along a seam, and a shining area may hold water so shallow it seems more like light than liquid. Nothing needs to be bold to matter here. The landscape is quiet enough for subtlety to become visible. In the heat of midday, subtlety can disappear into radiance, and the salt may seem almost blank again. The surface reflects sunlight with such strength that details soften, horizons waver, and the plain becomes a wide brightness rather than a collection of forms. This blankness is not empty, because it contains everything that morning revealed and evening will reveal again. It is simply the salar under a higher sun, withholding texture in light. The body can rest inside this brightness when imagined gently, not as glare, but as a soft white glow behind closed eyes. The salt flat becomes less a place to inspect and more a place to feel, with its vastness spreading through thought in every direction. There is no need to measure it or cross it. It is enough to let it be wide. The sky over the salar often feels unusually intimate with the ground, because the ground returns so much of the sky's light. Clouds seem to have weight here, and shadow seems to have shape, because the salt receives them clearly. When a cloud moves across the sun, the brightness lowers over a wide area, and the crust cools visually before it cools physically. The sky touches the ground through light. After rain, that touch becomes reflection. A cloud no longer only casts shadow. It appears beneath the body, floating in shallow water over salt. The mountains lean downward into the flooded surface, and the horizon becomes a gentle uncertainty. The effect can make Uyuni feel like the world has opened a second sky below the first. This second sky is shallow, temporary, and dependent on the crust's levelness, yet it changes perception profoundly. The water may be only a few centimeters deep, but it smooths irregularities and turns the mineral floor into an image of the air. It is the kind of transformation that feels dreamlike, because it asks so little material to do so much. A film of water becomes an entire atmosphere. As that water evaporates, it leaves behind fresh crystals, and the reflection gives way to texture again. The sky that appeared below the body becomes salt underfoot, and the mirror becomes a crust with edges, grains, and ridges. This return is not a failure of the mirror, because the mirror was always part of the cycle. Uyuni is strange because each state is temporary, and yet the cycle is enduring. You can imagine the surface after such drying, newly rough in places, glazed in others, with delicate salt films catching the morning light. Some crystals may grow as tiny cubes, others as crusty aggregates, and some as thin sheets laid down by the last evaporating water. These forms may last until the next rain, or be altered by wind, temperature, and pressure. The surface is a quiet workshop of mineral form. The workshop has no walls, no roof, and no sound except what air and footsteps bring. Its tools are sun, wind, water, salt, gravity, and time, all working with a patience that feels almost sleeping. The results are not manufactured objects, but textures and layers and patterns spread across a basin. Nature here does not decorate the landscape. It slowly becomes the landscape. The strangeness of Uyuni can also be felt through the absence of ordinary drainage. In many places, rainwater gathers into streams, streams become rivers, and rivers carry dissolved minerals toward the sea. Here, the basin keeps much of what enters, and the water's main escape is upward. This reversal of expectation from outward flow to upward leaving helps explain the salt's accumulation. Water enters visibly through rain and streams, but also invisibly through groundwater pathways. It can move through sediments, dissolve minerals, and arrive beneath or around the crust, joining the brine system without announcing itself at the surface. Some of this hidden water may be old, and some more recent, depending on depth and pathway. The Salar's hydrology is quiet because much of it is underground. The visible plain, then, is only the most luminous part of a larger water system. A dry crust does not mean the story of water has ended. It means water has changed location and form. It has moved into air as vapor, into salt as crystal history, into brine as hidden liquid, and into sediments as memory. Uyuni keeps water by transforming it. This transformation extends into the minerals themselves. Sodium and chloride form halite. Gypsum or other salts may appear under certain conditions, and many dissolved elements remain in brine, each following its own chemical tendencies. Some minerals precipitate when brine reaches one stage, while others wait until the solution becomes more concentrated. The result is a layered chemical landscape beneath the visible simplicity. A person standing above this system sees white space, but the earth below is sorting matter by solubility, density, and time. This sorting is not hurried, and it does not announce itself except through crust, brine, and layers. It is a calm kind of order, born from the repeated leaving of water. The longer the basin holds its materials, the more distinct its hidden chemistry becomes. The old lake sediments add another dimension, because they were formed not by crystallization alone, but by particles settling through water. Clay, silt, volcanic ash, organic traces in some settings, and mineral precipitates can accumulate in quiet sequences, each one tied to conditions at the time of deposition. These layers give the basin a memory beyond the salt itself. They show that Uyuni's present crust is part of a changing environment, not an isolated event. In Sleepwood imagination, sediment settling is one of the gentlest processes the earth offers. Fine grains drift downward through still water, slowly, evenly, and without urgency, until they come to rest at the bottom of a lake. More grains follow, and then more, building a layer no one can see forming in the moment. Over time, that invisible descent becomes part of the ground. Salt crystallization has a different softness, but it is equally patient. Invisible ions in brine arrange themselves into ordered solids, and what was dissolved becomes touchable, white, and reflective. The change feels almost like a thought becoming a word, except that here, the word is mineral, and the sentence stretches for miles. Uyuni is full of such quiet translations. The surrounding volcanic landscape adds depth to those translations. Materials born in heat can weather into dissolved chemistry, travel with water, and eventually become part of a cool salt crust under a high sky. The transformation from fire to salt is so slow and complete that it feels peaceful rather than dramatic. The earth has time to soften its own extremes. This is why the Salar can be described as strange without making it sharp or unsettling. Its strangeness is layered, gentle, and natural, made from contrasts that coexist calmly. Water becomes dryness, fire-born minerals become white crust, hidden brine supports visible salt, and a flat plain contains deep time. The more you notice these contrasts, the more restful they become. Late in the day, when sunlight lowers, the crust's pattern returns with particular clarity. The ridges cast long, fine shadows, and the polygon fields stretch outward like a woven surface. Though nothing here was woven by hand, the salt appears both delicate and immense, each seam part of a network too large to understand all at once. It is enough to follow one line for a while. That line may lead the eye toward a distant island, then lose itself in brightness, then reappear near the foreground as a raised edge catching gold light. The mind follows without effort, moving from detail to distance and back to detail again. This slow oscillation is one of the pleasures of Uyuni. It gives attention a path that never becomes urgent. As night approaches, color drains gradually from the salt, and the white plain becomes grey-blue under the cooling air. If the moon is rising, it may restore a softer kind of luminance, one that makes the crust look almost like frozen water. The old lake memory returns again, not through actual depth, but through appearance and feeling. The ground seems to float under the sky. In moonlight, the polygon ridges can appear as faint lines across a silvery field. Their shadows are gentle, their edges blurred, and the whole surface becomes less factual and more dreamlike, though the salt remains real beneath it. The mind can wander there easily, because the landscape has already reduced itself to a few quiet forms: light, line, plain, mountain, star. The stars above may seem especially numerous, but the salar does not compete with them. It reflects them only when water lies across the crust, and when dry, it simply rests beneath them with pale restraint. This restraint is beautiful because it gives the sky room. The salt flat does not fill the night. It holds it. Somewhere in the hidden brines, dissolved minerals remain in darkness, unaffected by the stars, and only slowly responsive to changes above. This separation between the visible night and the invisible chemistry below gives the landscape a deep calm. The surface receives light, while the subsurface keeps its mineral stillness. Both are part of Uyuni, and neither needs to disturb the other. The strange crust is therefore not just a surface to look at, but a meeting of scales. It holds microscopic crystal order, polygonal surface pattern, basin-wide flatness, regional climate history, and tectonic uplift of the Andes within one continuous place. A single view contains processes from the size of ions to the size of mountains. That is why the plain can feel empty and full at the same time. It is full of scale, and scale can be soothing when it is allowed to unfold slowly. The mind can move from one salt crystal to a polygon, from a polygon to the basin, from the basin to the plateau, and from the plateau to the sky without encountering any sharp edge. Everything connects by degrees. Uyuni is strange because its connections are so wide and so quiet. The basin also holds a kind of still balance between exposure and concealment. It exposes its flatness, brightness, and pattern completely under the open sky. Yet it conceals its brine, layers, and detailed chemistry beneath the crust. The visible part is simple, and the hidden part is complex. Together they create a landscape that invites both resting and wandering. As the night deepens, wandering can become softer and less specific. You do not need to remember every mineral, every lake phase, or every process that shaped the salar, because the feeling of them remains in the seeing. Water once lay here, and some water remains below. Minerals arrived, concentrated, crystallized, dissolved, and crystallized again. The crust is the quiet result. The old lake is not gone as a story, because it has become the geometry under moonlight and the brine under salt. It has become the levelness that lets rainwater reflect clouds, and the sediment layers that sleep beneath the visible plain. It has become the way distance feels on the salar, open and calm and difficult to measure. A vanished lake can remain very present. This presence is not haunting, but restful. The land does not mourn its former water. It holds that water's memory in another state, as all landscapes hold their changes without needing to return to what they were. The salt flat is not less than the lake. It is the lake's slow mineral afterlife. Near dawn, if you imagine the cycle continuing, frost or chill may touch the surface depending on conditions, and the crust may wait in cold stillness for the sun. Then light returns, evaporation resumes, and the white plain begins another day of subtle exchange with air and brine. The repetition is not monotonous, because each day carries small differences of wind, moisture, cloud, and temperature. Yet the larger rhythm remains reassuring. You can let that rhythm become the rhythm of resting. Water rises and leaves, salt gathers and holds, light appears and fades, and the basin remains open beneath the sky. Nothing in this sequence asks for effort. It is enough to drift with it. The strangeness of Uyuni is finally the strangeness of seeing change made still. A lake's disappearance has become a surface. Evaporation has become architecture, and hidden chemistry has become a plain wide enough to feel endless. The landscape looks motionless because its movements are slow, repeated, and distributed across too much space to witness at once. Stillness here is motion spread thin across time. And as the stars continue above the salt and the cold settles gently over the high basin, the crust keeps its quiet shape. The polygons lie under darkness, the brine rests below, and the old lake remains folded into every pale layer. You can imagine the salar stretching outward beyond thought, not empty, not asleep exactly, but deeply calm, holding water's memory in salt until the next soft rain returns.